In the remote wilderness of West Africa, beneath the scorching sun of 1966, 3 young men knelt beside a flower that would damn humanity forever. The indigenous tribes called it the stairway to the sun, a sacred bloom that granted visions of immortality. What Oswell Spencer, James Marcus, and Edward Ashford discovered in that moment would transform their names from obscure university students into architects of global apocalypse. The Progenitor virus, a microscopic organism capable of rewriting the very essence of life itself. Spencer's hands trembled as he collected the samples, not from fear but from pure ambition. He envisioned a world where death was optional, where human evolution could be controlled, where he could play God with the fundamental building blocks of existence. Marcus saw scientific glory beyond imagination. Ashford believed they were witnessing medical breakthrough that would save millions of lives. They were all wrong, and they were all right. What none of them realized as they carefully preserved those first viral specimens was that they had just unleashed something that would consume cities, topple governments, and transform the very definition of survival horror. The flower's beauty masked a predator older than civilization itself, a biological weapon that nature had perfected over millennia of evolution. The journey from that African expedition to the nuclear destruction of Raccoon City spans 32 years of corporate greed, scientific hubris, and systematic betrayal on a scale that defies comprehension. This is not just the story of zombies shambling through abandoned streets or monsters stalking terrified survivors through darkened corridors. This is the complete chronicle of how 3 university friends became the founding fathers of bioterrorism. From the pristine laboratories of Umbrella Pharmaceuticals to the blood-soaked ruins of American City, from the elegant boardrooms where death was marketed as medicine to the underground bunkers where human beings were reduced to test subjects, this timeline reveals every calculated decision that transformed medical research into humanity's greatest nightmare. You will discover how Edward Ashford's mysterious death in 1967 was far from accidental, and how his 10-year-old daughter Alexia would perfect a viral weapon so terrifying that even Umbrella Corporation would seal it away in Antarctic ice. You will witness James Marcus's assassination by his own protégés, only to watch him return as something no longer human, driven by a decade of festering revenge. You will follow the rise of Umbrella Corporation from pharmaceutical startup to global bioweapons empire, controlling entire cities, corrupting government agencies, and treating human lives as expendable resources in their quest for the perfect biological weapon. The T-virus, G-virus, and dozens of other viral strains represent more than scientific achievement. They represent the systematic abandonment of every ethical boundary that separates medicine from murder. But the true horror begins when containment fails. When the training facility Outbreak spreads its first zombie infection in July 1998, when the Spencer Mansion becomes a tomb filled with grotesque experiments, when Raccoon City's streets run red with the blood of 100,000 civilians, you will understand that every corporate decision, every covered-up experiment, every betrayal of trust was leading to this moment. The Progenitor virus discovered in that African flower was never meant to remain dormant. It was meant to spread. It was meant to evolve. It was meant to transform everything it touched into something unrecognizable. Spencer achieved his dream of controlling human evolution, but not in the way he imagined. Instead of creating a master race, he created an endless parade of bioterror incidents that continues to this day. The fall of Umbrella Corporation did not end the nightmare. It scattered viral research across dozens of shadow organizations, each one convinced they could succeed where Umbrella failed. From Los Iluminados parasites in Spanish villages to Ouroboros outbreaks in African mining facilities, from Neo-Umbrella's C-virus attacks to the countless unnamed incidents that never make international headlines, the legacy of that 1966 discovery continues to reshape the world in ways that would make Spencer weep with either pride or horror. This is the complete story of how medical research became biological warfare, how corporate ambition became global catastrophe, and how 3 university friends created a legacy that will haunt humanity for generations. Every zombie that rises, every mutation that spawns, every city that burns can trace its origins back to that moment in the African wilderness when 3 men picked a flower and doomed the world. But even knowing how this story ends, even understanding the full scope of the devastation that follows, there remains one question that will chill you to your core. In all the decades of viral outbreaks, corporate cover-ups, and bioterror attacks, in all the testimonies from survivors and confessions from dying executives, no one has ever answered the most terrifying question of all. The Progenitor virus, with its perfect ability to rewrite genetic code and transform living tissue, the virus that spawned every other biological weapon in Umbrella's arsenal, the virus that made T-virus, G-virus, and C-virus possible, shows signs of intelligent design that no natural evolution could produce. Which means someone or something created it long before Spencer, Marcus, and Ashford ever set foot in Africa. The year was 1960, and three brilliant young minds converged at a European university with dreams that would reshape the boundaries between life and death. Oswell Spencer, heir to British aristocracy, and obsessed with concepts of genetic superiority. James Marcus, a virologist whose understanding of cellular biology bordered on the supernatural. Edward Ashford, a biochemist whose gentle nature masked an intellect capable of unlocking nature's darkest secrets. Their friendship began in lecture halls and laboratories, but their destiny was written in the folklore of West African tribes who spoke in hushed whispers about flowers that could grant immortality to those brave enough to seek them. Indigenous legends told of sacred blooms hidden deep in the jungle, protected by ancient taboos and guarded by spirits that demanded terrible prices from those who disturbed their slumber. Spencer, driven by his aristocratic obsession with bloodline purity and genetic perfection, convinced his companions that these tribal legends contained scientific truth worth investigating. He funded the expedition from his family fortune, seeing in these stories the possibility of controlling human evolution itself. Marcus brought his expertise in viral research and cellular manipulation, eager to discover new biological mechanisms. Ashford, the most cautious of the three, joined primarily to ensure that whatever they discovered would be used for humanitarian purposes. The 1966 African expedition began as a standard botanical research mission. Official university records list it as a survey of indigenous medicinal plants with potential pharmaceutical applications. The reality was far more ambitious and infinitely more dangerous. Deep in the West African jungle, guided by tribal elders who believed these men possessed the wisdom to handle sacred knowledge, they found the source of the legends. The flower was unlike anything in botanical literature. Its petals shimmered with an otherworldly luminescence, and the air around it seemed to vibrate with barely contained energy. Local tribesmen called it the stairway to the sun, believing it connected the physical world to the realm of the spirits. They spoke of ancient rituals where chosen warriors would consume the flower's essence and emerge transformed, no longer fully human but not yet divine. Most who attempted the ritual died in agony. Those who survived were changed in ways that terrified even their own people. Edward Ashford was the first to recognize what they were truly observing. The flower contained a viral organism unlike anything in scientific literature. This was not a simple plant, toxin, or psychoactive compound. This was a complete biological rewriting system, capable of fundamentally altering the genetic structure of any living tissue it infected. They collected samples with trembling hands, each man understanding that they held something that could revolutionize medicine, biology, and perhaps the nature of life itself. The tribal elders watched with expressions of deep sadness, knowing that these outsiders would never understand the true cost of what they were taking. The journey back to civilization was fraught with strange incidents. Several expedition members fell ill with mysterious symptoms that defied medical explanation. Some recovered with enhanced physical capabilities. Others died in ways that would haunt the survivors for decades. Edward Ashford began showing signs of viral infection during the return journey, though the full implications would not become clear until much later. By 1967, back in their European laboratories, the three partners had isolated and began studying what they designated as the Progenitor virus. Initial research revealed capabilities that exceeded their wildest theoretical projections. The virus could rewrite genetic code with surgical precision, enhance physical attributes beyond normal human limits, and theoretically extend human lifespan indefinitely. But the Progenitor virus was not content to remain a passive research subject. Edward Ashford's condition deteriorated rapidly during their early experiments. The viral infection he had contracted in Africa began manifesting in ways that terrified his partners. His cellular structure was changing, his DNA rewriting itself according to patterns that followed no known biological laws. He died in 1967, officially from complications related to tropical disease exposure. The truth was far more horrifying. Ashford's death was not a failure of medical treatment. It was the first documented case of progenitor virus rejection, where the host organism's immune system engaged in a catastrophic war with the viral rewriting process. His body literally consumed itself trying to prevent the genetic transformation the virus demanded. Spencer and Marcus studied Ashford's remains, with a mixture of scientific fascination and growing terror. The viral samples extracted from his tissue showed evolutionary advancement that should have taken millions of years to develop. The progenitor virus was not simply infecting host organisms. It was learning from them, adapting to their biological defenses, and becoming more sophisticated with each exposure. In 1968, driven by a combination of scientific ambition and the desperate need to monetize their discovery before it could be stolen or regulated by government authorities, Spencer and Marcus established Umbrella Corporation. The company name itself reflected Spencer's vision of providing protective shelter for humanity's evolutionary advancement. Their official mission statement promised revolutionary pharmaceutical breakthroughs that would eliminate genetic disease and extend human lifespan. The reality was the beginning of systematic biological weapons development disguised as legitimate medical research. Alexander Ashford, Edward's surviving brother, joined the partnership primarily to honor his deceased siblings' memory and ensure that their discoveries would be used for humanitarian purposes. He brought with him his young daughter Alexia, a child prodigy whose understanding of genetic manipulation would eventually surpass even Marcus's expertise. The early years of Umbrella Corporation were marked by rapid expansion and carefully concealed research disasters. The progenitor virus proved impossible to control through conventional scientific methods. Every attempt to create stable, beneficial applications resulted in horrific mutations, violent behavioral changes, or complete cellular breakdown. Yet with each failure, with each test subject, who died screaming as their DNA rewrote itself, Spencer became more convinced that they were on the verge of unlocking humanity's next evolutionary stage. Marcus grew increasingly obsessed with perfecting viral delivery systems and enhancing the organism's rewriting capabilities. Alexander Ashford began documenting disturbing patterns in the viral behavior that suggested intelligence far beyond simple biological programming. By the late 1960s, Umbrella had established its first permanent research facility in the Arklay Mountains of the American Midwest. The location was chosen for its isolation, its proximity to government military installations, and its access to diverse test populations from nearby urban centers. The facility was officially designated as a pharmaceutical research center, developing treatments for genetic disorders. In reality, it became the first systematic biological weapons laboratory in human history, staffed by researchers who had convinced themselves that their work represented medical advancement rather than preparation for biological warfare. The progenitor virus, now stable enough for controlled experimentation, awaited the next phase of its evolution. It had survived its first encounter with human scientific manipulation. It had learned from the death of Edward Ashford, and deep within its microscopic structure, patterns were forming that would eventually produce the T virus, the G virus, and dozens of other biological weapons. But even as Spencer, Marcus, and Alexander Ashford celebrated their early successes in viral cultivation and corporate expansion, none of them suspected that their partnership was already infected with the same destructive potential as the virus they studied. Spencer's ambitions were growing beyond scientific research toward dreams of genetic superiority and controlled human evolution. Marcus was becoming obsessed with viral perfection to the exclusion of human concerns. And Alexander Ashford was beginning to suspect that the progenitor virus possessed characteristics that suggested it had been deliberately created by an intelligence that viewed humanity as nothing more than raw material for biological experimentation. The stage was set for decades of corporate betrayal, scientific hubris, and systematic transformation of medical research into biological warfare. The progenitor virus had found perfect human partners to facilitate its spread across the globe. And in the depths of the Arklay Mountains facility, the first human test subjects were already beginning their transformation into something that was no longer recognizably human. The death of Edward Ashford sent ripples of panic through the fledgling partnership, but Oswald Spencer saw opportunity where others saw tragedy. Within months of his friend's funeral, Spencer had convinced Alexander Ashford and James Marcus that their greatest tribute to Edward's memory would be transforming their research into a legitimate pharmaceutical empire. The year was 1968, and Umbrella Corporation emerged from grief with the cold precision of a surgical blade. Spencer's vision extended far beyond simple corporate success. While his partners focused on medical applications and humanitarian goals, Spencer's private journals from this period reveal an obsession with human genetic superiority that bordered on the messianic. He believed the progenitor virus represented nature's blueprint for the next stage of human evolution, and he intended to guide that transformation personally. Alexander Ashford, consumed by guilt over his brother's death and desperate to ensure their discoveries would save rather than destroy lives, threw himself into legitimate pharmaceutical development. His daughter Alexia, now approaching her 7th birthday, displayed an intellect that unnerved even the brilliant scientists surrounding her. She had begun reading her grandfather's research notes, asking questions about viral genetics that demonstrated comprehension levels that should have been impossible for someone her age. Marcus approached the partnership with scientific fervor that masked growing ethical concerns. His viral research had advanced beyond anything documented in academic literature, but each breakthrough revealed disturbing patterns in the progenitor virus behavior. The organism seemed to adapt and learn from each exposure to human tissue, developing resistance to containment measures and showing signs of what could only be described as strategic thinking. The early 1970s marked Umbrella's transformation from research collective to corporate powerhouse. Spencer's family wealth provided initial funding, but their legitimate pharmaceutical breakthroughs generated revenue streams that allowed for massive expansion. Patents on revolutionary treatments for genetic disorders, advanced surgical techniques, and cutting-edge medical equipment established Umbrella as a leader in biotechnology innovation. Behind the corporate facade, however, the real work continued in underground facilities that appeared on no official blueprints. The Arclay laboratory, constructed throughout the early 1970s, became the epicenter of biological weapons research disguised as medical advancement. Spencer had learned from Edward Ashford's death that progenitor virus research required absolute secrecy and expendable test subjects. The construction of the Arclay facility represented a masterpiece of deceptive engineering. The above-ground structures housed legitimate pharmaceutical research and development, complete with tours for government inspectors and academic visitors. Beneath the surface, a network of laboratories holding cells and disposal systems created a self-contained biological weapons development complex. Marcus established his primary research center in the underground levels, where he could pursue viral enhancement without oversight or ethical constraints. His work during this period focused on creating a more stable and controllable version of the progenitor virus, one that could transform human subjects without the catastrophic cellular breakdown that had killed Edward Ashford. The training facility, completed in 1978, served dual purposes that reflected Umbrella's evolving corporate structure. Officially, it provided education and preparation for Umbrella's executive protection teams and international security personnel. The reality was far more sinister. The facility became a testing ground for biological weapons effectiveness, staffed by researchers who had convinced themselves that their work served legitimate defense purposes. Throughout the 1970s, Umbrella's recruitment programs identified promising young individuals who could be molded into future corporate assets. Children from troubled backgrounds, military veterans with psychological profiles suggesting loyalty over conscience, and brilliant scientists willing to abandon ethical considerations for unlimited research funding. These recruitment efforts created a network of personnel who would serve Umbrella's true purposes without fully understanding the scope of their involvement. Albert Wesker entered Umbrella's sphere during this period, initially as a promising young researcher with expertise in biochemistry and behavioral psychology. Spencer recognized Wesker's potential immediately, not just as a scientist but as someone whose moral flexibility and ambition made him ideal for the company's darker objectives. Wesker's early assignments involved legitimate medical research, but Spencer gradually exposed him to more sensitive projects. William Birkin, another recruit from this era, displayed unprecedented understanding of viral genetics and cellular manipulation. Unlike Wesker, whose loyalty was purely transactional, Birkin became genuinely passionate about the scientific possibilities that Umbrella's resources made possible. His research complemented Marcus's work perfectly, creating a collaborative dynamic that accelerated their viral development programs. The mid-1970s brought Umbrella's first major international expansion. Facilities in Europe, Asia, and South America provided global reach for both legitimate pharmaceutical operations and classified biological weapons research. Each international facility followed the same basic structure, with public operations concealing underground research complexes. During this expansion phase, Umbrella encountered its first serious competition from other pharmaceutical corporations that had recognized the potential profits in biological enhancement research. Companies like Tricell began developing their own viral research programs, often by attempting to steal Umbrella personnel and research data. These corporate espionage wars created a climate of paranoia and secrecy that suited Spencer's purposes perfectly. Alexander Ashford's concerns about the direction of Umbrella's research grew throughout the 1970s. He had joined the partnership to honor his brother's memory and ensure their discoveries would benefit humanity, but the increasing focus on biological weapons development troubled him deeply. His attempts to redirect research toward purely medical applications met with resistance from Spencer, who argued that defense contracts provided necessary funding for humanitarian projects. The tension between Ashford and Spencer reached a critical point when Ashford discovered evidence of human experimentation in the underground facilities. Test subjects, officially described as volunteers participating in experimental medical treatments, were being exposed to increasingly dangerous viral strains without proper consent or safety protocols. Ashford's protests led to heated confrontations with Spencer, who insisted that such sacrifices were necessary for the greater good of human advancement. Alexia Ashford, now approaching her 10th birthday, had become a constant presence in the research facilities. Her intellectual development had accelerated to the point where she could contribute meaningfully to viral research discussions, often proposing solutions that eluded older, more experienced scientists. Alexander recognized that his daughter's genius was both a blessing and a curse, as Spencer's interest in her capabilities grew more intense with each passing month. Marcus's research during the late 1970s produced the first major breakthrough in progenitor virus enhancement. By combining the original viral strain with DNA from various animal sources, he created hybrid organisms that displayed enhanced stability and predictable transformation patterns. His experiments with leech DNA proved particularly promising, as leeches possessed natural regenerative capabilities that complemented the virus's genetic rewriting functions. The development of what would eventually become the T-virus represented a collaborative effort between Marcus's viral research and Birkin's cellular manipulation techniques. Their combined work produced a biological weapon that could transform human subjects into controllable, enhanced organisms while maintaining enough intelligence to follow basic commands. The military applications were immediately apparent, but the researchers convinced themselves they were developing medical treatments for degenerative diseases. Spencer's private ambitions during this period extended beyond simple biological weapons development. His journals from the late 1970s revealed plans for using viral enhancement to create a new ruling class of genetically superior humans, with himself as their leader. He saw traditional humanity as an evolutionary dead end, destined to be replaced by those brave enough to embrace genetic transformation. The Tyrant Project emerged from these grandiose visions, representing Spencer's attempt to create the perfect fusion of human intelligence and viral enhancement. The project required test subjects with specific genetic markers that would allow them to survive the transformation process while retaining cognitive abilities. Finding suitable candidates became a priority for Umbrella's recruitment and acquisition programs. By 1980, Umbrella Corporation had achieved a level of influence that extended far beyond the pharmaceutical industry. Government contracts for biological defense research provided official sanction for their weapons development programs. Military partnerships granted access to testing facilities and expendable personnel. Corporate acquisitions brought competing research programs under Umbrella control. The legitimate face of Umbrella continued to produce revolutionary medical breakthroughs that saved millions of lives and generated enormous profits. Cancer treatments, surgical innovations, and genetic therapies, established the company's reputation as a humanitarian organization dedicated to improving human health. These public achievements provided perfect cover for the classified research that would eventually threaten humanity's existence. Marcus's position within the corporate hierarchy had grown precarious by the early 1980s. His ethical concerns about human experimentation and weapons development put him at odds with Spencer's increasingly radical vision. The partnership that had begun with shared dreams of medical advancement was fracturing under the weight of competing moral philosophies and personal ambitions. The stage was set for betrayals that would reshape Umbrella's structure and accelerate the development of biological weapons beyond anything the original partners had envisioned. Spencer's patience with dissent was wearing thin, and he had begun making plans that would eliminate obstacles to his ultimate goals. Marcus's days as a founding partner were numbered, and the consequences of Spencer's ambitions would soon reach far beyond corporate boardrooms. Alexander Ashford's growing opposition to the weapons research made him equally expendable in Spencer's calculations. The death of Edward Ashford had been a tragic accident, but Spencer had learned valuable lessons about the importance of controlling potential opposition. The Progenitor virus offered methods of eliminating problems that were both efficient and deniable. Young Alexia Ashford represented both the greatest opportunity and the greatest threat to Spencer's plans. Her intellectual capabilities could accelerate viral research beyond current limitations, but her moral development under Alexander's influence might make her another obstacle to overcome. Spencer began making arrangements to secure Alexia's cooperation through methods that would ensure her loyalty while eliminating her father's problematic influence. The corporate ascension was nearly complete. Umbrella had evolved from a small research partnership into a global bioweapons empire with resources that rivaled small nations. The infrastructure for biological warfare development was in place, staffed by brilliant researchers who had rationalized away their ethical concerns. All that remained was the elimination of internal opposition and the acceleration of viral weapons programs. The next phase would test whether the partnerships built on shared scientific curiosity could survive the pressures of unlimited ambition and competing visions for humanity's future. The Progenitor virus had already claimed Edward Ashford's life and transformed the surviving partners into architects of biological warfare. Soon it would demand additional sacrifices from those who had unleashed its potential upon the world. The year 1981 would forever be remembered within Umbrella's classified archives as the moment when theoretical research crossed into horrifying reality. In the sterile laboratories of the Antarctic Research Facility, a 10-year-old girl named Alexia Ashford achieved what teams of experienced virologists had deemed impossible. She had perfected the T. Veronica virus, a biological weapon so advanced that it made the original Progenitor strain seem primitive by comparison. Alexia's intellectual development had accelerated beyond anything documented in psychological literature. By age 8, she was contributing to doctoral-level research. By 9, she had identified critical flaws in existing viral enhancement programs that had eluded senior researchers for years. Her understanding of genetic manipulation transcended simple academic knowledge, approaching an intuitive comprehension that unsettled even her father Alexander. The Antarctic facility had been constructed specifically to house the Ashford family's independent research programs, far from Spencer's direct oversight and Marcus's competing projects. Alexander Ashford had insisted on this isolation, partly to protect his daughter from Spencer's growing interest in her capabilities, and partly because he suspected their research was advancing into territories that required absolute containment. The T. Veronica virus represented Alexia's attempt to solve the fundamental problem that had plagued all previous enhancement programs. The Progenitor virus and its derivatives caused catastrophic cellular breakdown in most subjects, with survival rates that made practical application impossible. Alexia theorized that the viral rejection occurred because existing strains tried to rewrite human DNA too rapidly and too completely. Her solution involved combining Progenitor virus samples with genetic material from ancient plant species and prehistoric insect DNA that she had somehow obtained through Umbrella's global research network. The resulting hybrid organism could integrate with human cellular structure gradually, allowing the host organism to adapt to genetic changes without triggering immune system rejection. The theoretical applications were staggering. Subjects infected with T. veronica could potentially achieve immortality while retaining full cognitive function and gaining enhanced physical capabilities that exceeded anything achieved through other viral programs. Unlike the shambling zombies produced by T-virus exposure, T. veronica subjects would become superior beings capable of complex reasoning and strategic thinking. Alexia's first test subject was herself. On a cold December morning in 1981, while her father worked in another section of the facility, Alexia deliberately infected herself with the perfected T. veronica strain. Her calculations indicated that someone of her age and genetic profile had the highest probability of successful integration, but she had also recognized that her father would never permit human trials involving his own daughter. The initial viral integration proceeded exactly as Alexia had predicted. Instead of the violent cellular breakdown that characterized other viral infections, her body began adapting to the genetic modifications gradually. Her enhanced intellect allowed her to monitor and document her own transformation with scientific precision, recording observations that would prove invaluable for future research. However, Alexia had also calculated that complete T. veronica integration required a period of dormancy during which the virus could rewrite her genetic structure without interference from conscious biological processes. She had prepared a cryogenic preservation system that would maintain her body in suspended animation for 15 years while the transformation completed itself. Alexander Ashford discovered his daughter's condition 3 days after her self-infection. The laboratory recordings revealed her complete experimental procedure and her rationale for proceeding without parental consent. Alexia had left detailed instructions for maintaining her cryogenic suspension and predicted timetables for her eventual revival as a fully integrated T. veronica subject. The discovery destroyed Alexander psychologically and professionally. His brilliant daughter had achieved the breakthrough that would establish her as the greatest virologist in human history, but the cost was losing her for 15 years, while she underwent transformation into something that might no longer be recognizably human. His grief and guilt consumed him completely. Alfred Ashford, Alexia's twin brother, experienced a psychological break that would define the rest of his life. His sister's apparent death and his father's subsequent emotional collapse left him alone in the Antarctic facility, with only automated systems and research equipment for companionship. The isolation and trauma triggered dissociative episodes where he began believing he could communicate with his cryogenically preserved sister. Alexander's attempts to continue research without Alexia's guidance proved disastrous. His emotional state compromised his scientific judgment, leading to increasingly desperate experiments as he tried to develop treatments that could accelerate his daughter's revival process. His work became erratic and dangerous, with safety protocols abandoned in favor of rapid results. The final catastrophe occurred in 1983 when Alexander accidentally exposed himself to an unstable T. veronica variant during one of his revival experiments. Unlike his daughter's carefully calculated self-infection, Alexander's exposure resulted in immediate and violent transformation. His body began mutating into something monstrous, retaining his consciousness but trapping it within increasingly inhuman anatomy. The creature that Alexander became possessed enhanced physical capabilities and extended lifespan, but his appearance became so grotesque that even his son Alfred could barely tolerate his presence. Alexander, now designated as Nosferatu in the facility records, maintained enough intelligence to understand what he had become and to realize that his condition was irreversible. Alfred sealed the Antarctic facility and implemented automated systems designed to maintain both his sister's cryogenic suspension and his father's containment indefinitely. The official reports to Umbrella headquarters described a laboratory accident that had claimed both Alexander and Alexia's lives, with Alfred listed as the sole survivor requiring psychological treatment for trauma-related disorders. Spencer received these reports with mixed emotions. Alexander Ashford's death eliminated one of the primary obstacles to his more radical research programs, but losing Alexia represented a devastating setback to Umbrella's biological weapons development. Her intellectual capabilities had promised breakthroughs that could have advanced their programs by decades. The truth about Alexia's survival and transformation remained hidden within the sealed Antarctic facility, known only to Alfred, who had convinced himself that his sister's cryogenic preservation was temporary and that she would eventually return to complete their research together. His deteriorating mental state, led him to create elaborate fantasies about conversations with the frozen Alexia and plans for their eventual reunion. Marcus learned about the Antarctic incident through corporate channels, but the sanitized reports provided few details about what had actually occurred during the Ashford family's final experiments. He suspected that Alexander's research had achieved significant breakthroughs before the fatal accident, but Spencer's classification of all Ashford research made investigation impossible. The loss of the Ashford research program accelerated Marcus's own viral development projects. With Alexia no longer contributing innovations and Alexander's theoretical frameworks unavailable, Marcus became the primary architect of Umbrella's biological weapons advancement. The pressure to produce results comparable to Alexia's achievements drove him to take risks with viral experimentation that he had previously considered too dangerous. Spencer's response to the Antarctic tragedy revealed the calculating nature that would define his later corporate decisions. Rather than mourning the loss of valuable research partners, he immediately began planning to acquire the Ashford facility and research data. The family's misfortune represented opportunity to consolidate control over Umbrella's most sensitive programs. The sealed Antarctic facility became a forgotten monument to scientific ambition and family tragedy. Automated systems continued maintaining Alexia's cryogenic suspension and Alexander's containment, while Alfred descended deeper into madness, alone with his delusions and his decaying family legacy. The facility's location and harsh climate ensured that the truth about T. Veronica development would remain hidden for decades. Umbrella's corporate records were altered to reflect the official version of events, with the Ashford family tragedy classified as a cautionary example of inadequate safety protocols, rather than a breakthrough in viral weapons development. This cover-up established patterns of information control that would characterize Spencer's leadership throughout the following decades. The broader implications of Alexia's achievement remained unknown to the scientific community. Her perfection of T. Veronica represented a quantum leap in biological weapons capability, but with her in cryogenic suspension and her research sealed in the Antarctic facility, the breakthrough provided no immediate benefit to Umbrella's development programs. Marcus's relationship with Spencer began deteriorating as the corporate hierarchy shifted following Alexander's death. With the Ashford family no longer providing counterbalance to Spencer's influence, Marcus found himself increasingly isolated within the partnership structure. Spencer's vision for Umbrella's future conflicted fundamentally with Marcus's scientific priorities. The T-virus development program, now Marcus's primary responsibility, proceeded with renewed urgency, but also increased pressure to produce military applications. Spencer's corporate ambitions required biological weapons that could be deployed quickly and controlled reliably, rather than the theoretical perfection that had characterized Alexia's research approach. Birkin's role within the research hierarchy expanded significantly during this period, as Spencer recognized his potential value as a counterweight to Marcus's growing independence. Birkin's willingness to pursue aggressive research timelines and his flexibility regarding ethical constraints made him an ideal ally for Spencer's corporate objectives. The Antarctic facility's automated systems continued their vigilant maintenance of the Ashford family's secrets while the outside world forgot about their contributions to viral research. Alexia remained in her cryogenic chamber, her body slowly adapting to T. Veronica integration, while her consciousness waited in suspension for the day when her transformation would be complete. Alfred's psychological deterioration accelerated as the isolation continued. His conversations with the cryogenically preserved Alexia became more elaborate and delusional, but he maintained enough technical competence to keep the facility operational. His dedication to his sister's eventual revival became the organizing principle of his increasingly fragmented existence. The tragedy of the Ashford family demonstrated the ultimate consequences of unchecked scientific ambition combined with inadequate emotional support systems. Brilliant minds pursuing revolutionary research without proper oversight or psychological preparation had created a situation where breakthrough achievements came at the cost of human sanity and family bonds. Spencer's corporate empire had claimed its first casualties among the founding families, but the lessons learned from the Antarctic incident would shape his approach to managing future research programs. Control over information, isolation of dangerous projects, and elimination of potential opposition became standard practices in Umbrella's operational structure. The year 1983 ended with Umbrella Corporation fundamentally transformed by tragedy and ambition. The partnership that had begun with shared dreams of medical advancement had become a weapons development enterprise, where human costs were acceptable sacrifices for scientific progress. The stage was set for even greater betrayals and more devastating consequences, as Spencer's vision for human evolution moved closer to implementation. Marcus remained unaware that his own position within the corporate hierarchy had become as precarious as the Ashfords had been. Spencer's patience with independent thinking and ethical concerns was exhausted, and plans were already forming that would eliminate the last obstacles to absolute control over Umbrella's biological weapons programs. The Progenitor virus had claimed Edward Ashford's life in 1967, and T. Veronica had consumed the rest of his family by 1983. The viral research that began with hopes of medical breakthrough had become a generational curse that destroyed everyone it touched while advancing toward applications that would threaten all of humanity. The mid-1980s marked the apex of Umbrella Corporation's dual existence as both humanitarian pharmaceutical giant and clandestine biological weapons empire. James Marcus, now the undisputed leader of viral research following the Ashford family tragedy, had achieved something that would define the next phase of human warfare. He had perfected the T-virus, transforming the unpredictable progenitor strain into a weapon system that could reliably produce controllable biological soldiers. Marcus's breakthrough came through an unlikely partnership with nature's most efficient predators. His experiments with leech DNA had revealed that these simple creatures possessed regenerative capabilities that complemented the progenitor virus's genetic rewriting functions perfectly. Leeches could regenerate lost tissue, survive extreme environmental conditions, and maintain cellular cohesion during rapid genetic transformation. When combined with the progenitor-based strain, leech genetic material created a hybrid organism that could transform human subjects without the catastrophic cellular breakdown that had plagued earlier experiments. The T-virus designation stood for Tyrant Virus, reflecting Spencer's grandiose vision for the ultimate biological weapons it would produce. Unlike the shambling, mindless creatures that resulted from failed progenitor exposures, T-virus subjects retained enough cognitive function to follow basic commands while gaining enhanced strength, resilience, and pain tolerance that made them ideal military assets. Marcus's research facility deep beneath the training facility had become a monument to scientific achievement and human sacrifice. Thousands of test subjects, officially designated as volunteers participating in experimental medical treatments, had contributed their lives to perfecting the T-virus formula. Each failure provided data that brought Marcus closer to his goal of creating the perfect balance between human intelligence and viral enhancement. The human cost of this research was systematically documented and rationalized away by researchers who had convinced themselves that individual sacrifices were justified by the greater good of human advancement. Medical ethics committees within Umbrella reviewed sanitized versions of the research protocols, approving studies that appeared to involve standard pharmaceutical development rather than biological weapons testing. Lisa Trevor, one of the facility's longest-serving test subjects, had become something unprecedented in viral research. Her exposure to multiple experimental strains had created a biological anomaly that seemed to integrate beneficial aspects of various viruses while rejecting their harmful effects. She had achieved functional immortality, surviving exposures that should have killed her dozens of times, while maintaining enough human consciousness to recognize familiar faces and remember fragments of her past life. Lisa's condition fascinated Marcus and terrified him in equal measure. Her immunity to viral damage suggested that the right genetic combination could allow humans to transcend normal biological limitations without losing their essential humanity. However, her physical transformation had rendered her appearance grotesquely inhuman, and her behavioral patterns indicated psychological damage that made her unpredictable and potentially dangerous. Spencer's corporate vision during this period extended far beyond simple weapons development. His private communications with select board members revealed plans for using T-virus technology to create a new social order where genetic enhancement determined social hierarchy. Traditional concepts of human equality would become obsolete when some individuals possessed capabilities that exceeded normal human limitations by orders of magnitude. The Tyrant Project emerged from these philosophical frameworks as Spencer's attempt to create the perfect fusion of human intelligence and viral enhancement. The project required test subjects with specific genetic markers that would allow them to survive T-virus integration while retaining cognitive abilities necessary for complex reasoning and strategic thinking. These enhanced super soldiers would form the elite military force for Spencer's New World Order. Umbrella's legitimate pharmaceutical operations provided perfect cover for recruiting test subjects and acquiring necessary resources for biological weapons development. Medical research volunteers, military personnel seeking enhanced performance treatments, and patients desperate for experimental cures all contributed unknowingly to programs designed to perfect human transformation rather than preserve human health. William Birkin's role within the research hierarchy had expanded significantly as Marcus's most promising protégé. Birkin's understanding of cellular biology and genetic manipulation complemented Marcus's viral research perfectly, creating a collaborative dynamic that accelerated T-virus development beyond anything Spencer had projected. Their partnership represented the pinnacle of scientific achievement in biological weapons development. The training facility itself had evolved into a comprehensive testing ground for evaluating T-virus applications under realistic combat conditions. Military scenarios were constructed to assess the effectiveness of various biological weapons against conventional forces, with results that consistently demonstrated the overwhelming advantages that viral enhancement provided in tactical situations. International expansion during this period established umbrella facilities across 6 continents, each one following the same basic structure of legitimate pharmaceutical operations, concealing classified biological weapons research. The global network provided access to diverse genetic populations for research purposes, while creating redundant development programs that could continue even if individual facilities were compromised. European facilities focused on advanced tyrant development, building on research frameworks established by the Ashford family before their tragic end. Asian installations concentrated on mass production techniques that could generate biological weapons in quantities sufficient for large-scale military deployment. South American operations specialized in environmental adaptation, developing viral strains that could function effectively in tropical climates and diverse ecological conditions. The corporate culture within Umbrella's classified divisions had evolved to normalize activities that would have horrified outside observers. Researchers routinely discussed human experimentation with the same clinical detachment they applied to testing pharmaceutical compounds on laboratory animals. The psychological mechanisms that allowed intelligent, educated individuals to participate in systematic atrocities became subject matter for Umbrella's own behavioral research programs. Marcus's personal relationship with Spencer had grown increasingly strained as their visions for T-virus applications diverged. Marcus remained focused on scientific perfection and theoretical advancement, while Spencer pushed for immediate military applications that could generate revenue and political influence. The tension between pure research and practical deployment created conflicts that would ultimately prove irreconcilable. Raccoon City's development as Umbrella's primary corporate headquarters reflected Spencer's ambitions for total control over urban populations. The city had been constructed around Umbrella facilities, with municipal government, law enforcement, and civic institutions all dependent on corporate funding and oversight. Citizens of Raccoon City lived within a carefully controlled environment where Umbrella's influence extended into every aspect of daily life. The Raccoon City Police Department, established ostensibly to provide standard law enforcement services, actually functioned as Umbrella's private security force for containing potential security breaches and managing public relations around corporate activities. Officers were recruited based on their loyalty to corporate interests rather than their commitment to public safety, creating a force that would prioritize company security over civilian protection when conflicts arose. Underground transportation systems connected Umbrella facilities throughout Raccoon City, allowing for secure movement of personnel, research materials, and test subjects without public observation. The infrastructure represented billions of dollars in investment designed to create a self-contained corporate ecosystem where biological weapons development could proceed without external interference. Advanced biodevelopment programs had produced dozens of creature types designed for specific military applications. Hunters provided close combat capabilities that exceeded human soldiers in speed and lethality. Lickers offered reconnaissance and infiltration abilities that made conventional security measures obsolete. Each biological weapon represented months of research and testing to optimize effectiveness for particular tactical situations. The psychological profiles of successful T-virus subjects revealed patterns that troubled some researchers but excited Spencer's strategic planners. Subjects who retained cognitive function after viral integration consistently demonstrated reduced empathy, increased aggression, and enhanced willingness to follow commands without moral considerations. These behavioral changes made them ideal military assets, but raised questions about what humanity meant when fundamental human characteristics could be systematically eliminated. International intelligence agencies had begun detecting evidence of Umbrella's biological weapons programs through various channels, but the company's legitimate pharmaceutical success and government research contracts provided effective cover for classified activities. Corporate security departments worked constantly to identify and neutralize potential intelligence leaks while maintaining plausible deniability for all weapons research. Marcus's research notes from the late 1980s reveal growing concerns about the long-term implications of T-virus technology. His calculations suggested that viral weapons designed for military applications possessed characteristics that could make containment impossible if they were ever deployed outside controlled laboratory conditions. The very attributes that made T-virus effective as a weapon also made it potentially catastrophic as an uncontrolled contagion. Spencer dismissed Marcus's containment concerns as excessive caution that hindered practical development. The potential for global catastrophe was acceptable risk when weighed against the revolutionary military advantages that biological weapons could provide to nations and corporations wise enough to develop them first. Traditional warfare would become obsolete when one side possessed the ability to transform enemy populations into allied forces through viral conversion. The golden age of bioweapons development was reaching its zenith, but the partnership between Spencer and Marcus was approaching its breaking point. Spencer's impatience with scientific caution and Marcus's growing ethical concerns about weapons applications created an irreconcilable conflict that would soon require resolution through methods that reflected the brutal nature of the research they had jointly pursued. Corporate records from this period, later discovered in Umbrella's sealed archives, reveal the extent to which normal human moral considerations had been systematically abandoned in favor of scientific advancement and profit maximization. The T-virus represented not just a biological weapon but a complete transformation of how human beings could be viewed and utilized as resources for corporate and military objectives. The stage was set for betrayals that would test whether the scientific partnership that had created the world's most dangerous biological weapons could survive the pressures of competing ambitions and conflicting moral philosophies. Marcus's position as Umbrella's chief researcher had made him indispensable, but Spencer's vision for the company's future increasingly required elimination of anyone whose conscience might interfere with practical applications of their revolutionary discoveries. The Tyrant project was nearing completion, promising to produce biological weapons that combined human intelligence with viral enhancement in ways that would redefine the nature of warfare itself. The question was whether Marcus would live to see his scientific achievements deployed in the service of Spencer's ultimate ambitions for reshaping human civilization according to genetic hierarchies and corporate control. The late 1980s witnessed Umbrella Corporation's transformation from regional pharmaceutical company into a shadow empire that operated across continents with resources rivaling those of nation-states. Spencer's vision of global biological weapons dominance required infrastructure that could function independently of any single government's oversight, creating a network of facilities that answered only to corporate headquarters and the increasingly secretive Executive Council. European expansion began with the acquisition of existing pharmaceutical research facilities in France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. These legitimate operations provided perfect cover for establishing classified biological weapons laboratories that could access diverse genetic populations for research purposes. The European facilities specialized in advanced tyrant development, building on theoretical frameworks that had emerged from Marcus's T-virus research and the tragic remnants of Ashford family innovations. The Paris laboratory became notorious within Umbrella's classified records for producing some of the most sophisticated Bioweapons variants ever documented. French researchers, working with enhanced T-virus strains and unlimited funding, developed creatures that retained enough human intelligence to operate complex machinery while possessing physical capabilities that exceeded normal human limitations by enormous margins. These enhanced subjects could infiltrate military installations, sabotage critical infrastructure, and eliminate specific targets with precision that conventional biological weapons could never achieve. Asian operations centered on facilities constructed in remote regions of China and Southeast Asia, where political instability and government corruption created ideal conditions for conducting research that would attract unwanted attention in more regulated environments. These installations focused on mass production techniques that could generate biological weapons in quantities sufficient for large-scale military deployment, transforming viral research from laboratory curiosity into industrial process. The manufacturing approaches developed in Asian facilities represented breakthrough innovations in biological engineering. Researchers discovered methods for cultivating T-virus organisms in controlled environments that could produce thousands of doses with consistent potency and predictable transformation timelines. Quality control procedures ensured that biological weapons manufactured in these facilities would perform reliably under battlefield conditions while maintaining enough stability for long-term storage and international distribution. South American operations established research stations deep within rainforest environments that provided access to unique ecological systems and genetic diversity unavailable elsewhere on Earth. The biodiversity of tropical ecosystems offered unlimited opportunities for discovering new viral enhancement possibilities, while remote locations ensured that experimental failures could be contained without risking exposure to civilian populations or international monitoring agencies. Brazilian facilities became testing grounds for environmental adaptation research, developing viral strains that could function effectively across diverse climate conditions and ecological niches. Researchers working in these installations discovered that certain tropical plant species contained compounds that enhanced viral stability and transmission rates, leading to breakthrough developments in biological weapons deployment methodology. The corporate culture within Umbrella's international network had evolved sophisticated mechanisms for maintaining operational security, while facilitating collaboration between research teams separated by thousands of miles. Encrypted communication systems allowed scientists to share experimental data and theoretical innovations without creating documentation trails that could compromise classified programs if discovered by intelligence agencies. Personnel rotation policies ensured that individual researchers never gained complete knowledge of Umbrella's global operations, while maintaining continuity in research programs that required years of sustained effort. Scientists might spend months working on specific aspects of biological weapons development, without understanding how their contributions fitted into larger strategic objectives, creating compartmentalization that protected corporate secrets even from the researchers who generated them. Competition from rival pharmaceutical corporations had intensified significantly as other companies recognized the enormous profit potential in biological enhancement research. Tricell Corporation, established by former Umbrella personnel who had defected with valuable research data, began developing parallel biological weapons programs that threatened Umbrella's market dominance in this emerging field. Corporate espionage operations became routine aspects of biological weapons development as companies attempted to steal research data, recruit competitor personnel, and sabotage rival programs through methods that ranged from conventional industrial espionage to assassination of key researchers. The biological weapons industry had created its own shadow economy, where information was more valuable than traditional currency, and human lives were acceptable costs for maintaining competitive advantages. International intelligence agencies had begun detecting evidence of widespread biological weapons proliferation through various monitoring systems, but the legitimate pharmaceutical activities of companies like Umbrella provided effective cover for classified research programs. Government officials in multiple countries received regular briefings about potential bioweapons threats, while simultaneously approving research contracts that funded the very programs they claimed to monitor. The relationship between corporate biological weapons development and government military research created complex webs of collaboration and competition that served everyone's interests except those of civilian populations who might eventually face deployment of these weapons systems. Military officials wanted access to revolutionary tactical advantages while maintaining plausible deniability about their involvement in prohibited weapons development. William Birkin's research during this period had begun exploring applications that extended far beyond Spencer's original vision for military biological weapons. His experiments with genetic modification, suggested possibilities for creating entirely new forms of life that could serve corporate and military objectives in ways that traditional biological weapons could never achieve. The G-Virus project emerged from Birkin's theoretical work on genetic adaptation and controlled evolution. Unlike T-virus applications that transformed existing organisms into enhanced versions of their original forms, G-virus technology could potentially create biological entities designed from genetic foundations to serve specific purposes. The implications were staggering for military applications and terrifying for anyone who understood the potential consequences of uncontrolled deployment. Birkin's research notes from the late 1980s reveal scientific ambitions that exceeded even Spencer's grandiose visions for biological weapons applications. He envisioned creating biological systems that could adapt to any environmental challenge, survive indefinitely without external support, and reproduce through methods that ensured rapid population expansion under battlefield conditions. Marcus's growing concerns about containment and ethical implications had created increasing tension with Spencer's aggressive expansion timeline. Marcus understood better than anyone the catastrophic potential that biological weapons possessed if deployment procedures failed or if viral organisms evolved beyond their intended parameters. His attempts to establish stronger safety protocols met with resistance from corporate leadership focused on maintaining competitive advantages over rival companies. The training facility had expanded significantly to accommodate testing requirements for the diverse biological weapons being developed across Umbrella's global network. New sections provided specialized environments for evaluating creature performance under various tactical scenarios, from urban warfare simulations to wilderness survival challenges that tested biological weapons' effectiveness across different operational contexts. Research subjects for these expanded testing programs came from increasingly diverse sources, as Umbrella's recruitment networks reached into military organizations, prison systems, and medical facilities around the world. Corporate recruiters had developed sophisticated methods for identifying individuals whose disappearance would attract minimal attention, while ensuring access to genetic profiles that represented broad spectrum of human biological diversity. The psychological conditioning programs developed for Umbrella personnel had become essential components of maintaining operational security across the expanded international network. Researchers working on biological weapons development received psychological preparation designed to normalize activities that would traumatize individuals without proper mental conditioning, while security personnel underwent training that eliminated normal human responses to violence and suffering. Corporate management recognized that biological weapons development required human resources who could function effectively in environments where conventional moral considerations had been systematically abandoned. The psychological preparation programs ensured that personnel could participate in research activities without developing emotional attachments to test subjects or ethical concerns about experimental procedures. International legal frameworks governing biological weapons research had failed to adapt the rapid technological developments that companies like Umbrella were achieving in classified laboratories. Existing treaties and oversight mechanisms had been designed for conventional biological agents rather than the sophisticated viral organisms that represented the cutting edge of weapons development. Corporate legal departments worked constantly to identify regulatory loopholes and jurisdictional gaps that allowed biological weapons research to continue without violating international agreements that governments had signed to prevent proliferation of prohibited weapons systems. The globalized nature of Umbrella's operations created opportunities for conducting research in locations where enforcement mechanisms were weakest. Spencer's personal vision for biological weapons applications had evolved beyond military objectives toward broader goals of social transformation through controlled genetic enhancement. His private communications with select corporate executives revealed plans for using viral technology to create new social hierarchies based on genetic capabilities rather than traditional measures of human achievement. The philosophical implications of Spencer's ambitions extended far beyond conventional warfare toward fundamental questions about what human civilization would become when genetic modification technology made traditional concepts of human equality obsolete. Spencer believed that biological weapons represented evolutionary tools that could accelerate human development in directions that natural evolution would require millions of years to achieve. Government military research programs in multiple countries had begun developing parallel biological weapons capabilities, often using research data obtained through corporate partnerships or industrial espionage operations directed against companies like Umbrella. The proliferation of viral weapons technology was accelerating beyond any single organization's ability to control or contain. International cooperation agreements between government agencies and private corporations created complex relationships where classified military research funded corporate biological weapons development, while corporate innovations enhanced government military capabilities. These partnerships ensured that viral weapons technology would continue advancing regardless of political changes or international treaty obligations. The stage was set for confrontations that would test whether the global biological weapons industry could maintain operational security while pursuing increasingly ambitious research objectives. Marcus's ethical concerns and Spencer's ruthless expansion plans were approaching collision points that would require resolution through methods that reflected the brutal nature of the research they had jointly created. Corporate records from this period document the systematic transformation of pharmaceutical research into biological weapons development on a scale that would reshape international relations and military strategy for generations. The spreading viral influence had created a shadow industry where human lives were acceptable costs for achieving scientific breakthroughs that promised revolutionary advantages in future conflicts. The question was no longer whether biological weapons would be deployed in military conflicts, but rather which organizations would control their development and application. When containment inevitably failed and viral organisms began evolving beyond their creators' intentions or ability to manage. The partnership that had transformed medical research into biological warfare empire was fracturing under pressures that neither Spencer nor Marcus had anticipated when they established Umbrella Corporation 20 years earlier. By 1988, their fundamental disagreement about research ethics and practical applications had evolved into irreconcilable conflict that threatened the stability of the entire corporate structure they had built together. Marcus's position within Umbrella's hierarchy had become increasingly precarious as his ethical concerns about biological weapons development clashed with Spencer's aggressive expansion timeline. The senior researcher who had perfected the T-virus and established the theoretical foundations for most of Umbrella's breakthrough innovations found himself marginalized by corporate leadership that viewed scientific conscience as liability rather than asset. The philosophical divide between the two men reflected broader tensions within the biological weapons research community about the appropriate boundaries for scientific inquiry and practical application. Marcus remained committed to controlled laboratory research that prioritized understanding viral mechanisms over immediate military deployment, while Spencer pushed for rapid weaponization that could generate revenue and political influence regardless of potential consequences. Spencer's private communications with select board members during this period reveal the calculating nature of his approach to resolving the conflict with Marcus. Rather than attempting compromise or seeking alternative solutions, Spencer had already decided that Marcus's continued influence represented an unacceptable obstacle to achieving Umbrella's strategic objectives. The elimination of Marcus would require methods that reflected the brutal nature of their research, while maintaining plausible deniability for corporate leadership. The assassination plot that Spencer developed demonstrated the systematic abandonment of human decency that biological weapons research had fostered within Umbrella's corporate culture. Marcus, who had dedicated his professional life to advancing their shared scientific vision, would be eliminated by the very research partners he had trained and mentored throughout their careers. Albert Wesker and William Birkin received their assignment from Spencer with the cold professionalism that characterized Umbrella's approach to problem solving. Both men understood that Marcus's elimination was necessary for maintaining their own positions within the corporate hierarchy, but they also recognized that the assassination would fundamentally alter their relationship with the organization they served. The method chosen for Marcus's assassination reflected Spencer's preference for solutions that served multiple corporate objectives simultaneously, rather than conventional murder that would create investigation risks and potential legal complications. Spencer ordered Marcus to be killed through exposure to his own viral research. The assassination would eliminate opposition, while providing valuable experimental data about T-virus effects on human subjects with specific genetic profiles. July 1988 marked the end of James Marcus's life, and the beginning of something that would ultimately threaten everything Spencer had built through decades of corporate expansion and biological weapons development. Marcus's death in the underground laboratory where he had achieved his greatest scientific triumphs seemed to conclude the partnership dispute decisively in Spencer's favor. Wesker and Birkin disposed of Marcus's body in the facility's organic waste processing systems, following standard procedures for eliminating experimental subjects whose research value had been exhausted. The assassination appeared to have been executed perfectly, removing Spencer's primary internal opposition while maintaining operational security that protected corporate leadership from potential consequences. The official corporate records documented Marcus's disappearance as resignation from active research duties, followed by retirement to private medical treatment for undisclosed health issues. Umbrella's personnel departments processed paperwork that transferred Marcus's research responsibilities to Birkin, while maintaining pension and benefit payments that suggested normal voluntary departure from company service. Spencer's consolidation of power within Umbrella, following Marcus's elimination, proceeded exactly according to his strategic calculations. Research programs that had been delayed by Marcus's ethical objections were accelerated immediately, while safety protocols that had limited experimental procedures were relaxed to allow more aggressive testing of biological weapons applications. The training facility continued operating under automated systems that Marcus had designed, but the research priorities shifted dramatically toward practical weapons development rather than theoretical advancement. Test subjects were exposed to increasingly dangerous experimental procedures as researchers pursued rapid results that would demonstrate immediate military applications for T-virus technology. What Spencer, Wesker, and Birkin failed to understand was that Marcus's exposure to T-virus during his assassination had not resulted in typical cellular breakdown and death. The viral organisms that consumed his body had integrated with his consciousness in ways that defied everything their research had revealed about T-virus behavior patterns. The leeches that inhabited the facility's waste processing systems had been exposed to T-virus contamination for years through their consumption of experimental subjects and laboratory waste. When Marcus's infected remains entered their environment, the viral organisms facilitated unprecedented biological fusion between human consciousness and primitive nervous systems that had evolved over millions of years to function collectively. Marcus's individual identity merged with the queen leech that controlled the facility's extensive population of these creatures, creating hybrid consciousness that retained his memories, scientific knowledge, and burning desire for revenge against those who had betrayed him. The biological weapon that Spencer had used to eliminate opposition had instead created enemy with capabilities that exceeded anything their research had produced. The transformation process required nearly a decade to complete, as Marcus's consciousness gradually integrated with leech biology, while the T-virus rewrote genetic structures to accommodate unprecedented fusion between human intelligence and primitive collective organism. During this period, automated systems maintained facility operations while the underground laboratories became breeding ground for hybrid creatures that would eventually serve Marcus's revenge. Umbrella's corporate expansion accelerated dramatically following Marcus's apparent elimination, as Spencer no longer faced internal opposition to his most aggressive biological weapons development programs. International facilities received increased funding and expanded research mandates, while safety protocols were systematically relaxed to allow experimental procedures that Marcus would never have approved. The Tyrant project advanced rapidly through development phases that had been delayed for years by Marcus's insistence on extensive safety testing and controlled deployment procedures. Military applications that Spencer had prioritized over scientific understanding moved toward completion, as research teams competed to produce results that would satisfy corporate leadership demands for immediate practical applications. Birkin's rise within the corporate hierarchy reflected Spencer's preference for researchers whose loyalty was purely transactional and whose scientific ethics were flexible enough to accommodate any experimental procedures that served corporate objectives. Birkin's willingness to pursue aggressive research timelines and his indifference to test subject welfare made him ideal replacement for Marcus's leadership role. The G-virus research program that Birkin had begun developing represented his attempt to exceed Marcus's T-virus achievements, while demonstrating capabilities that would ensure his continued value to Spencer's corporate vision. Birkin understood that individual survival within Umbrella's structure required producing innovations that exceeded previous breakthroughs while maintaining absolute loyalty to corporate leadership. International intelligence agencies had begun detecting evidence of increased biological weapons activity through monitoring systems that tracked research material acquisitions, personnel movements, and facility construction projects. However, Umbrella's legitimate pharmaceutical operations continued providing effective cover for classified weapons development programs. Government oversight mechanisms that were supposed to monitor biological weapons research had been systematically compromised through corruption, misdirection, and the placement of Umbrella personnel in regulatory positions that allowed corporate interests to influence policy decisions. The regulatory framework that should have prevented biological weapons proliferation instead facilitated its acceleration. Corporate security operations had evolved sophisticated capabilities for identifying and neutralizing potential threats to operational security, using methods that ranged from conventional surveillance and intimidation to biological weapons testing on individuals who posed risks to classified programs. The elimination of Marcus had established precedents for dealing with internal opposition that would guide future corporate decisions. The psychological conditioning programs that prepared Umbrella personnel for participation in biological weapons research had been refined based on experience gained from Marcus's assassination and its aftermath. Researchers and security personnel received enhanced training designed to eliminate normal human responses to violence while strengthening loyalty to corporate objectives over personal relationships. Spencer's vision for Umbrella's future had crystallized around concepts of genetic hierarchy and controlled human evolution that would reshape civilization according to biological capabilities rather than traditional social structures. The elimination of Marcus had removed the primary obstacle to implementing research programs designed to create new forms of human life, optimized for serving corporate and military objectives. The facility systems that Marcus had designed and programmed continued operating according to his original specifications, but the research priorities they supported had been fundamentally altered by Spencer's agenda. Equipment that Marcus had intended for controlled scientific advancement was being used for biological weapons production that exceeded safe operational parameters. Underground chambers that had served as Marcus's private laboratory became tomb where his transformed consciousness waited for the biological development necessary to implement revenge against those who had betrayed him. The decade-long transformation process would eventually produce hybrid organism capable of challenging Spencer's control over the corporation they had built together. The stage was set for confrontation that would test whether Spencer's ruthless consolidation of corporate power could survive the consequences of eliminating research partners whose scientific contributions had made Umbrella's success possible. Marcus's apparent death had removed immediate opposition to biological weapons development, but it had also created an enemy whose capabilities would ultimately exceed anything Spencer's corporate empire could produce to defend itself. The first cracks in containment were spreading through systems that Marcus had designed, as automated processes continued maintaining research programs. While hybrid consciousness that had once been human gradually acquired capabilities necessary for systematic destruction of everything Spencer valued most. 10 years of patient biological development had transformed James Marcus from murdered scientist into something that defied every classification system that Umbrella's researchers had developed for understanding viral organisms. The queen leech that had consumed his remains had become vessel for consciousness that retained human memories, scientific knowledge, and burning desire for revenge while gaining capabilities that exceeded anything Spencer's corporate empire had produced. July 1998 marked the beginning of Marcus's systematic destruction of everything that Spencer had built using betrayal and murder. The hybrid consciousness that had emerged from a decade of viral transformation possessed intimate knowledge of Umbrella's facilities, personnel, and security systems combined with biological capabilities that made conventional containment measures useless. The training facility that had served as Marcus's primary research installation and eventual tomb became ground zero for revenge that would reshape Umbrella Corporation's understanding of what their biological weapons could become when guided by human intelligence and personal motivation. Automated systems that Marcus had designed and programmed responded to commands from consciousness that had evolved far beyond their original creator. Rebecca Chambers had joined STAR's Bravo team as medic, whose pharmaceutical knowledge and combat training made her a valuable asset for investigating incidents that combined medical emergencies with potential terrorist activities. Her assignment to investigate mysterious deaths in the Arklay mountain region seemed routine for someone with her background and specialized skills. Billy Cohen represented a different type of problem for military authorities, who needed someone with combat experience to disappear without creating bureaucratic complications. His court-martial for alleged war crimes in Africa had been convenient cover for recruiting him into operations where conventional military personnel would ask uncomfortable questions about mission parameters and rules of engagement. The military transport that was supposed to deliver Billy to execution facility never reached its destination. Instead, both Rebecca and Billy found themselves confronting biological horrors that exceeded anything their training had prepared them to understand or survive. The Ecliptic Express, Umbrella's private railway system designed for transporting research materials and personnel between facilities, had become a mobile laboratory for testing viral weapons against human subjects under realistic conditions. Marcus's consciousness, distributed throughout the extensive leech population that inhabited Umbrella's underground facilities, could observe and control events across multiple locations simultaneously. His revenge against Spencer required more than simple destruction of corporate assets. Marcus intended to demonstrate the futility of Spencer's biological weapons programs by using them to destroy the infrastructure and personnel that made Umbrella's continued operation possible. The viral organisms that infested the training facility had been evolving under Marcus's guidance for years, developing characteristics that reflected both his scientific understanding and his desire for systematic revenge. Creatures that emerged from this extended development process possessed intelligence and coordination capabilities that exceeded anything documented in Umbrella's official research records. Rebecca's medical training allowed her to recognize that the biological hazards they encountered represented deliberate rather than accidental contamination. The systematic nature of viral infection throughout the facility suggested coordinated deployment rather than containment failure, indicating that someone with intimate knowledge of Umbrella's research programs was orchestrating events for specific purposes. Billy's military experience provided different perspective on their situation, as his combat background allowed him to assess tactical implications of biological weapons deployment in contained environments. The creatures they encountered demonstrated strategic thinking and coordinated behavior that suggested command structure rather than random viral mutation. The partnership that developed between Rebecca and Billy reflected necessity rather than mutual trust, as both individuals recognized that survival required cooperation with someone whose capabilities complemented their own. Rebecca's medical knowledge proved essential for understanding viral contamination risks, while Billy's combat skills provided protection against biological threats that conventional weapons could barely affect. Marcus's systematic elimination of Umbrella personnel within the training facility served multiple purposes beyond simple revenge. Each death provided additional biological material for viral experimentation, while demonstrating to corporate leadership that their security measures were inadequate for containing threats that possessed intimate knowledge of facility operations and unlimited access to biological weapons. The discovery of Marcus's research logs and experimental records revealed the true scope of T-virus development that had been hidden from Spencer and other corporate executives. Marcus's private research had advanced far beyond officially documented programs, producing viral variants and biological weapons that exceeded anything Spencer had imagined possible when he ordered Marcus's assassination. Corporate security teams that attempted to investigate the training facility incidents found themselves confronting biological weapons that had been specifically designed to counter conventional military tactics and equipment. Marcus's creatures could adapt to combat situations in real time, developing countermeasures against weapons and strategies as battles progressed. The psychological impact on Umbrella personnel who survived encounters with Marcus's revenge operations extended beyond immediate trauma to fundamental questions about corporate security and leadership competence. Researchers and security staff began questioning whether Spencer's leadership was adequate for protecting them from threats that emerged from their own research programs. Rebecca's pharmaceutical knowledge proved crucial for understanding how viral contamination spread through facility ventilation systems and water supplies, creating environmental hazards that made extended survival impossible without specialized protective equipment. Her medical training also revealed disturbing patterns in creature behavior that suggested viral organisms were being guided by intelligence that understood human psychology and tactical thinking. Billy's combat experience with biological weapons in African conflicts provided context for understanding how viral contamination could be deployed as area denial weapon that made territories uninhabitable for conventional military forces. His tactical assessment of their situation indicated that whoever controlled the biological weapons possessed capabilities that exceeded anything he had encountered during his military service. The Ecliptic Express incident demonstrated Marcus's ability to coordinate complex operations across multiple locations while maintaining operational security that prevented corporate authorities from identifying the source of attacks against Umbrella facilities. The mobile nature of railway-based operations made tracking and containment impossible using conventional security measures. Marcus's hybrid consciousness allowed him to monitor corporate communications and security responses in real time, adapting his revenge operations to counter every defensive measure that Spencer's organization attempted to implement. The biological network that connected leech populations throughout Umbrella's facilities provided surveillance and communication capabilities that exceeded anything corporate security could detect or neutralize. The destruction of the training facility through explosive systems that Marcus had installed years earlier served as final demonstration that Spencer's biological weapons programs contained inherent vulnerabilities that made them unsuitable for practical deployment. Marcus's intimate knowledge of facility operations allowed him to manipulate safety systems designed to contain viral outbreaks, turning protection measures into weapons against the personnel they were supposed to protect. Rebecca and Billy's escape from the facility provided them with evidence about Umbrella's biological weapons programs that would eventually contribute to corporate prosecution and public exposure of classified research activities. However, their immediate survival required reaching authorities who could protect them from corporate elimination efforts while investigating the crimes they had witnessed. The psychological transformation that both survivors experienced during their ordeal reflected broader patterns that characterized human responses to biological weapons exposure. Even individuals who survived direct encounters with viral organisms suffered permanent psychological damage that affected their ability to function normally in civilian environments. Marcus's revenge operations against Spencer's corporate empire had achieved their primary objective of demonstrating that biological weapons development contained inherent risks that made practical deployment impossible without accepting catastrophic consequences. The training facility incident proved that Umbrella's security measures were inadequate for containing threats that possessed intimate knowledge of corporate operations and unlimited access to biological weapons. Corporate authorities who received reports about the training facility destruction initially dismissed survivor accounts as trauma-induced hallucinations, but physical evidence of biological weapons deployment and facility destruction made denial impossible. Spencer's leadership faced its first serious challenge from consequences of decisions made during Umbrella's earlier development phases. The precedent established by Marcus's successful revenge operations would inspire other researchers and corporate personnel who had grievances against Spencer's leadership to consider similar actions. The training facility incident demonstrated that individual scientists possessed capabilities for challenging corporate authority through methods that conventional security could not prevent or contain. International intelligence agencies that had been monitoring Umbrella's activities received their first concrete evidence of biological weapons deployment through survivor testimonies and physical evidence from the training facility destruction. The incident provided justification for expanded surveillance and potential military intervention against corporate biological weapons programs. The stage was set for escalating confrontations between Marcus's hybrid consciousness and Spencer's corporate empire, as revenge operations expanded beyond individual facility destruction towards systematic elimination of personnel and infrastructure that made Umbrella's continued operation possible. The biological weapons that Spencer had used to eliminate opposition were now being deployed against the corporate structure that had created them. Marcus's patient development of biological capabilities during his decade-long transformation had produced hybrid organism capable of challenging Spencer's control over global biological weapons development. The training facility incident was merely the first phase of revenge operations designed to destroy everything Spencer valued while demonstrating the futility of attempting to control evolutionary forces that exceeded human understanding or management capacity. The Spencer Mansion had served as Umbrella's crown jewel of biological weapons research for nearly 3 decades. Its elegant Victorian architecture concealing underground laboratories, where the most classified experiments in human history had been conducted. By July 1998, The mansion represented Spencer's last hope for containing the escalating crisis that Marcus's revenge operations had unleashed across Umbrella's global network. The facility's dual nature reflected Spencer's philosophy of hiding monstrous activities behind facades of respectability and scientific legitimacy. Visitors to the mansion's upper levels encountered beautifully appointed rooms filled with classical art and sophisticated entertainment areas suitable for hosting international dignitaries and potential investors. Below ground, a maze of laboratories, holding cells, and disposal systems created the infrastructure necessary for systematic human experimentation on a scale that exceeded anything documented in wartime medical atrocities. Lisa Trevor had become the mansion's most valuable and most terrifying research subject through decades of viral experimentation that should have killed her thousands of times. Her exposure to every strain of biological weapon that Umbrella had developed since the 1970s had created biological anomaly that possessed functional immortality, while retaining enough human consciousness to remember fragments of her previous life. The transformation that Lisa had undergone represented both Umbrella's greatest scientific achievement and their most horrifying failure. She had achieved the genetic enhancement that Spencer envisioned for humanity's evolutionary future. But the psychological cost had been complete destruction of everything that made her recognizably human. Her immortal existence served as living demonstration of what Spencer's vision would mean for individuals subjected to viral enhancement programs. Marcus's hybrid consciousness had identified the Spencer Mansion as the symbolic heart of everything he intended to destroy through his revenge operations. The facility where Spencer had consolidated power after Marcus's assassination would become the stage for confrontation that would determine whether corporate biological weapons programs could survive challenges from their own creations. The STARS Alpha Team deployment to investigate the mansion represented Spencer's desperate attempt to eliminate witnesses to corporate biological weapons activities, while testing combat effectiveness of his most advanced creations against highly trained human opponents. The mission parameters had been designed by Albert Wesker to ensure that team members would encounter biological weapons under conditions that would result in maximum casualties. Chris Redfield's military background and survival instincts allowed him to recognize immediately that the mansion incident represented coordinated attack rather than accidental outbreak. His experience with combat situations provided crucial advantages for navigating environments where conventional tactics were inadequate for surviving encounters with biological weapons that had been specifically designed to counter human military capabilities. Jill Valentine's expertise in bomb disposal and tactical operations complemented Chris's combat skills perfectly, creating partnership that could adapt to rapidly changing threat environments while maintaining focus on mission objectives that evolved continuously as they discovered more about Umbrella's true activities. Her technical knowledge proved essential for understanding facility systems and security measures. The psychological impact of encountering zombies for the first time challenged fundamental assumptions about reality that had guided human civilization for millennia. These creatures represented violation of natural laws that defined boundaries between life and death, forcing survivors to reconstruct their understanding of what was possible while fighting for survival against enemies that should not exist. Wesker's betrayal of his own team reflected the complete moral transformation that participation in Umbrella's biological weapons programs had produced in personnel who had originally joined for legitimate law enforcement purposes. His willingness to sacrifice colleagues who trusted him demonstrated how corporate loyalty had replaced normal human emotional connections in individuals whose psychological conditioning prioritized organizational objectives over personal relationships. The Tyrant T-002 represented Spencer's attempt to create the perfect fusion of human intelligence and viral enhancement, but the creature's deployment against STARS team members revealed fundamental flaws in biological weapons design that made practical military applications impossible. The Tyrant's inability to distinguish between enemy targets and corporate personnel made it unsuitable for deployment in situations where friendly forces might be present. Rebecca Chambers' arrival at the mansion following her survival of the training facility incident provided crucial intelligence about Marcus's revenge operations and the broader scope of Umbrella's biological weapons programs. Her medical expertise allowed the team to understand viral contamination risks, while her recent combat experience prepared her for encounters with biological weapons. The discovery of Umbrella's research records within the mansion laboratories revealed the systematic nature of human experimentation that had been conducted over decades of corporate operations. Documents detailing thousands of test subjects, experimental procedures, and disposal methods provided evidence of crimes against humanity that exceeded anything committed by previous totalitarian regimes. Marcus's presence within the mansion through his distributed leech consciousness allowed him to observe and influence events while remaining undetectable through conventional surveillance methods. His ability to manipulate facility systems and biological weapons provided tactical advantages that made conventional military responses ineffective against his revenge operations. The psychological conditioning that Umbrella researchers had received to normalize participation in human experimentation began breaking down when they found themselves targeted by the same biological weapons they had helped develop. Scientists who had rationalized atrocities against test subjects experienced terror and helplessness when they became subjects themselves. Corporate security teams that attempted to contain the mansion incident discovered that their training and equipment were inadequate for confronting biological weapons that possessed intelligence, adaptability, and strategic thinking capabilities. Conventional military tactics failed against enemies that could regenerate from injuries, coordinate attacks, and adapt countermeasures in real time. The mansion's self-destruct system represented Spencer's ultimate contingency plan for eliminating evidence of biological weapons research. If containment failed and exposure became inevitable, the nuclear device hidden within the facility's infrastructure was designed to vaporize all traces of corporate activities while creating cover story about industrial accident. Chris and Jill's survival of encounters with dozens of biological weapon variants demonstrated that individual humans could overcome viral creatures through intelligence, determination, and tactical adaptation. But their success required extraordinary circumstances that would be impossible to replicate in large-scale military deployment scenarios. The mansion incident provided Umbrella's corporate leadership with crucial intelligence about biological weapons' effectiveness against trained human opponents, while simultaneously demonstrating that their security measures were inadequate for containing threats that possessed intimate knowledge of facility operations and unlimited access to corporate resources. Wesker's apparent death during the Tyrant encounter served Spencer's objectives by eliminating potential witness to corporate biological weapons programs, while providing cover for Wesker's extraction and reassignment to other classified operations. The staged death allowed Wesker to continue serving corporate interests without the complications that his star's identity would create. The destruction of the Spencer mansion through nuclear self-destruct eliminated physical evidence of decades of human experimentation, while creating radioactive contamination that would prevent detailed forensic investigation of the facility's underground laboratories. Spencer's damage control measures prioritized corporate protection over environmental consequences. Survivor testimonies about the mansion incident provided international intelligence agencies with detailed accounts of Umbrella's biological weapons capabilities, but the destruction of physical evidence made prosecution difficult, while corporate legal departments prepared strategies for discrediting witness credibility through psychological evaluation and character assassination. The psychological trauma experienced by mansion survivors reflected patterns that would characterize human responses to biological weapons encounters throughout future incidents. Even individuals who survived direct combat with viral creatures suffered permanent psychological damage that affected their ability to function normally in civilian environments. Marcus's successful manipulation of events within the Spencer mansion demonstrated that his hybrid consciousness possessed capabilities for challenging Spencer's corporate empire that exceeded anything conventional opposition could achieve. The biological weapons that Spencer had developed for military applications were now being deployed against the infrastructure and personnel that made Umbrella's continued operation possible. The mansion incident established precedents for biological weapons deployment in contained environments that would guide future corporate and military planning for similar scenarios. The tactical lessons learned from STARS, Team Survival, provided valuable intelligence about human adaptation to viral threats while revealing vulnerabilities in biological weapons design. International media attention focused on the Arklay Mountain region, following the mansion explosion, created public awareness of mysterious incidents that corporate public relations departments struggled to explain without revealing classified information about biological weapons research. The cover stories about industrial accidents and terrorist attacks provided temporary protection, but increased scrutiny from investigative journalists. Corporate personnel who had participated in Mansion operations experienced psychological breakdown as they confronted the reality that their biological weapons research had created threats that could target them personally. The abstract nature of laboratory experimentation became horrifyingly concrete when researchers found themselves potential victims of their own creations. The stage was set for escalating confrontations between Marcus's revenge operations and Spencer's corporate empire, as biological weapons developed for military applications were systematically deployed against the infrastructure and personnel that had created them. The Mansion incident proved that Umbrella's security measures were inadequate for containing threats that possessed intimate knowledge of corporate operations. Spencer's desperate measures to contain the crisis through nuclear destruction and witness elimination had succeeded temporarily, but the broader implications of biological weapons deployment were spreading beyond corporate control. The survivors who escaped the Mansion carried evidence and testimonies that would eventually contribute to Umbrella's downfall, while international agencies began preparing responses to threats that exceeded conventional military capabilities. September 1998 would become the month when theoretical biological weapons research crossed into practical deployment, with consequences that exceeded every catastrophic scenario that Umbrella's risk assessment departments had developed during 3 decades of corporate planning. The convergence of government pressure, corporate greed, and individual desperation created perfect conditions for unleashing viral contamination that would transform an entire American city into testing ground for humanity's most dangerous scientific achievements. William Birkin had spent the previous decade developing the G-virus as his personal insurance policy against corporate betrayal and government seizure of his research. Unlike the T-virus, which transformed subjects into controllable biological weapons, the G-virus represented an evolutionary leap that could create entirely new forms of life optimized for survival and reproduction under any environmental conditions. Birkin's creation exceeded Spencer's original vision for human enhancement by orders of magnitude. The United States military's decision to seize G-virus research reflected growing government concern about biological weapons proliferation and the potential threat that unregulated corporate research posed to national security. Intelligence agencies had been monitoring Umbrella's activities for years, but the evidence collected from Mansion survivors and training facility incidents had finally provided justification for direct military intervention. The government's approach to Birkin demonstrated the naive assumption that individual scientists would prioritize patriotic duty over personal ambition when confronted with official demands for cooperation. Military planners failed to understand that decades of corporate conditioning had transformed Umbrella researchers into individuals whose loyalty belonged exclusively to their scientific work rather than any external authority. Birkin's laboratory deep beneath Raccoon City represented the culmination of biological weapons research that had begun with the Progenitor virus discovery 30 years earlier. The facility contained research data, experimental subjects, and viral samples that represented the collective knowledge of humanity's most advanced biological weapons programs. Losing control of this installation would set back military biological research by decades, while providing foreign governments with access to weapons technology that could reshape international power balances. The psychological profile that Umbrella's personnel departments had developed for Birkin revealed an individual whose intellectual arrogance and scientific obsession made him inherently unstable when confronted with external pressure. His identification with his research was so complete that any attempt to separate him from his work would trigger defensive responses that prioritized protecting scientific achievements over personal survival. The Umbrella Security Service team that received orders to eliminate Birkin and secure G-virus samples approached their mission with professional detachment that reflected the systematic dehumanization that characterized corporate biological weapons programs. These operatives had been conditioned to view human targets as expendable obstacles rather than individuals with families, relationships, and personal histories that gave their lives meaning beyond corporate utility. Sherry Birkin's presence in the laboratory during the government seizure operation represented tragic consequence of allowing research personnel to maintain normal family relationships while participating in classified weapons development. William Birkin's decision to bring his young daughter into environments contaminated with experimental biological agents demonstrated the compromised judgment that intensive research had produced in scientists whose personal lives had become secondary to their professional obsessions. The firefight that erupted between government forces and corporate security teams in the underground laboratory created conditions that made viral contamination inevitable. Weapons discharge in environments containing experimental biological agents violated every safety protocol that had been developed for handling dangerous research materials. But military planners had prioritized speed over containment in their operation design. Birkin's decision to inject himself with G-virus, rather than allow government forces to capture his research, represented ultimate expression of scientific ego and personal desperation. His willingness to transform himself into experimental subject rather than surrender his life's work to external control demonstrated the psychological extremes that biological weapons research had produced in individuals whose identity was inseparable from their scientific achievements. The initial stages of Birkin's G-virus transformation occurred rapidly as the viral organism began rewriting his genetic structure according to patterns that he had spent years perfecting through experimentation on countless test subjects. Unlike T-virus infections, which produced predictable zombie-like creatures, G-virus integration created a hybrid organism that retained human intelligence while gaining biological capabilities that exceeded anything documented in Umbrella's research records. The accidental release of T-virus into Raccoon City's water supply system occurred when damage from the laboratory battle compromised containment vessels that held experimental viral strains. The contamination spread through municipal infrastructure that had been designed for delivering clean water to civilian population, creating a distribution network that ensured every resident would be exposed to biological weapons within days. Corporate authorities who received initial reports about the laboratory incident immediately recognized that the situation exceeded Umbrella's capacity for damage control through conventional methods. The scale of potential civilian casualties and international attention would require responses that went far beyond corporate public relations capabilities, while potentially exposing decades of classified biological weapons research to public scrutiny. Spencer's reaction to news of the Raccoon City contamination revealed the calculating coldness that had characterized his leadership throughout Umbrella's evolution from pharmaceutical company to biological weapons empire. Rather than attempting to contain the outbreak and minimize civilian casualties, Spencer immediately began planning to use the crisis as large-scale testing opportunity for biological weapons effectiveness against urban population centers. The initial zombie infections that appeared throughout Raccoon City during the first days of September created panic among civilian authorities who lacked training or equipment for responding to biological weapons attacks. Police, medical personnel, and municipal officials found themselves confronting threats that exceeded anything their emergency response protocols had anticipated, while corporate influence prevented them from receiving accurate information about the nature of the crisis. Mayor Michael Warren's attempts to maintain order while protecting Umbrella's corporate interests demonstrated the extent to which municipal government had been compromised by decades of corporate influence and financial dependency. His decisions prioritized corporate damage control over civilian safety, ensuring that residents would remain trapped in contaminated urban environment while viral organisms spread through every neighborhood. The psychological impact on Raccoon City residents who witnessed friends and family members transforming into zombies created mass trauma that exceeded anything documented in disaster response literature. The violation of fundamental assumptions about death and human nature produced psychological breakdown that made rational responses to the crisis impossible for most civilians. Corporate security teams deployed throughout Raccoon City had orders to eliminate witnesses and recover research materials rather than assist civilian evacuation efforts. These operatives treated the viral outbreak as opportunity for field testing biological weapons against human targets, while gathering tactical intelligence about creature behavior in urban environments. International intelligence agencies that monitored the Raccoon City situation through satellite surveillance and communication intercepts recognized immediately that they were observing unprecedented deployment of biological weapons against civilian population. The implications for international security and biological weapons proliferation created urgent requirements for military intervention, while legal departments struggled with questions about sovereignty and appropriate response measures. The transformation of Raccoon City from thriving American metropolis into biological weapons testing ground represented culmination of every ethical compromise and moral failure that had characterized corporate biological weapons development since the Progenitor virus discovery. Thousands of innocent civilians became unwilling test subjects in experiments designed to evaluate viral effectiveness against diverse human populations under realistic urban conditions. Government military planners who had authorized the G-virus seizure operation found themselves confronting consequences that exceeded their worst-case scenario projections. The mission that was supposed to prevent biological weapons proliferation had instead triggered the first large-scale deployment of viral weapons against American civilians while providing Umbrella with invaluable combat effectiveness data. The stage was set for confrontation between corporate biological weapons programs and government military response that would test whether conventional forces possessed capabilities for containing viral outbreaks in urban environments. Raccoon City had become ground zero for humanity's first biological weapons war, with civilian populations serving as unwilling combatants in conflict that would reshape international understanding of modern warfare's potential consequences. Spencer's corporate empire had achieved the practical deployment of biological weapons that he had envisioned for decades, but the circumstances of that achievement had created enemies more dangerous than any foreign military force. The United States government now possessed direct evidence of corporate biological weapons programs, while international community began recognizing that biological warfare represented existential threat requiring unprecedented cooperative responses. The great corporate betrayal was complete. Umbrella had transformed from medical research company into biological weapons manufacturer that prioritized profit and scientific achievement over human life, while government authorities who had contracted for defensive research discovered that their corporate partners had been developing offensive capabilities that threatened global security. The consequences of these betrayals would reshape both corporate and government approaches to biological weapons research, while Raccoon City burned as monument to the ultimate failure of human wisdom and ethical restraint. The transformation of Raccoon City from American metropolis into viral wasteland proceeded with mathematical precision that would have impressed the researchers who had spent decades perfecting biological weapons for exactly this type of deployment. September 29, 1998, marked the point where individual survival became impossible through conventional means as viral contamination reached saturation levels that ensured every civilian remaining within city limits would encounter infected organisms within hours. Leon Kennedy's arrival as rookie police officer represented cruel irony of timing, as his first day of employment coincided with the complete breakdown of civil authority and social order that biological weapons deployment could produce in urban environments. His law enforcement training had prepared him for criminal activity and civil disturbances, but provided no framework for understanding or responding to threats that violated fundamental assumptions about life and death. Claire Redfield's decision to travel to Raccoon City in search of her brother Chris demonstrated the loyalty and determination that characterized individuals who could survive encounters with biological weapons through intelligence and adaptability, rather than special training or equipment. Her civilian background actually provided advantages in some situations, as she lacked preconceptions about proper tactical responses that might limit creative problem solving. The psychological impact of discovering that familiar urban environment had been transformed into hunting ground for creatures that should not exist created cognitive dissonance that overwhelmed most civilians before they could adapt to survival requirements. Streets that had provided safety and navigation landmarks became mazes of biological hazards, where wrong turns meant death in forms that exceeded human imagination. William Birkin's continuing transformation through successive G-virus mutations demonstrated the unlimited adaptive potential that biological weapons could achieve when guided by intelligence that retained enough human consciousness to learn from each encounter. His evolving form represented everything that Spencer had envisioned for biological weapons development, while simultaneously proving that such evolution could never be controlled or contained once initiated. The Raccoon City Police Department building had become fortress, where surviving law enforcement personnel attempted to maintain order while confronting biological threats that exceeded their training and equipment capabilities. The building's architecture provided temporary protection but also created trap where defenders faced inevitable defeat as viral contamination eliminated potential reinforcements and escape routes. Adol Wong's presence in Raccoon City during the outbreak represented the complex intelligence operations that biological weapons deployment had triggered among corporate and government agencies competing for access to viral research data. Her mission priorities demonstrated how individual human survival had become secondary to acquiring scientific information that could provide strategic advantages in emerging biological weapons competition. The sewer systems beneath Raccoon City had become breeding ground for biological weapons that thrived in environments where traditional sanitation and containment measures were impossible to maintain. The underground passages that had originally been designed to support urban infrastructure now provided a distribution network that ensured viral contamination would spread to every neighborhood, while offering protected routes for creature movement. Hospital facilities throughout the city became focal points for viral transformation, as medical personnel attempted to treat patients whose conditions exceeded every known treatment protocol. Healthcare workers found themselves administering care to individuals whose infections were progressing through stages that transformed them from human beings into biological weapons designed to attack the very people trying to help them. Corporate security operations continued throughout the city with objectives that prioritized data recovery and witness elimination over civilian protection or containment efforts. Umbrella personnel moved through Raccoon City with military precision, treating the viral outbreak as opportunity for field testing biological weapons while gathering intelligence about creature effectiveness against human targets under realistic urban conditions. The Nemesis T-type deployment represented Spencer's attempt to eliminate specific targets who possessed evidence about Umbrella's biological weapons programs, while testing advanced creature capabilities in complex urban environment. The creature's programming focused on hunting stars, team members whose survival of previous incidents made them priority targets for corporate elimination efforts. Sherry Birkin's survival, as infected but not transformed civilian, provided crucial evidence about G-virus effects on subjects with specific genetic characteristics, while demonstrating that some individuals possessed natural resistance to viral weapons that made complete transformation impossible. Her condition represented both hope for developing countermeasures and terror about what partial infection might mean for long-term human survival. The psychological conditioning that had prepared Umbrella personnel for participation in biological weapons research began breaking down when researchers found themselves trapped within the very urban environment they had helped transform into testing ground. Scientists who had rationalized laboratory experimentation on test subjects experienced existential crisis when they became subjects themselves in experiment that exceeded their control or understanding. Municipal infrastructure systems designed to support modern urban civilization became weapons of biological warfare as viral contamination spread through water supplies, electrical networks, and communication systems that connected every building and neighborhood. The technology that had enabled high-density urban living became a mechanism for ensuring that viral weapons would reach every potential human target. Military reconnaissance operations that attempted to assess the Raccoon City situation from outside the contamination zone provided government planners with real-time intelligence about biological weapons' effectiveness against civilian populations, while revealing the inadequacy of conventional military responses to viral outbreaks in urban environments. The media blackout that corporate and government authorities imposed to prevent public awareness of biological weapons deployment created information vacuum that allowed the crisis to escalate without external pressure for containment or civilian evacuation efforts. News organizations received sanitized reports about industrial accidents and terrorist attacks rather than accurate information about viral outbreak that threatened regional and potentially national security. International intelligence agencies that monitored the Raccoon City situation through satellite surveillance and communication intercepts recognized that they were observing unprecedented deployment of biological weapons against civilian population center. The implications for biological weapons proliferation and international security created urgent requirements for diplomatic and potentially military responses. Corporate legal departments worked constantly to develop liability strategies and damage control measures that could protect Umbrella's international operations from consequences of the Raccoon City incident, while maintaining plausible deniability about biological weapons research and deployment activities. The economic impact of losing an entire American city to biological weapons attack exceeded every financial model that insurance companies and government agencies had developed for evaluating disaster response costs. The implications for urban development, population distribution, and industrial security would reshape American domestic and international policy for decades. Survivor psychology research that would eventually emerge from the Raccoon City incident revealed patterns of trauma and adaptation that exceeded anything documented in disaster response literature. Individuals who survived encounters with biological weapons developed cognitive and behavioral changes that affected their ability to function in normal social environments while providing them with enhanced threat recognition and survival capabilities. The tactical lessons learned from biological weapons deployment in urban environment provided military planners with invaluable intelligence about viral warfare effectiveness, while revealing vulnerabilities in conventional defense strategies that would require fundamental changes in military doctrine and equipment development. Spencer's corporate empire achieved practical demonstration of biological weapons capabilities that exceeded every theoretical projection developed during 3 decades of research and development, while simultaneously creating evidence trail that would eventually lead to corporate prosecution and international regulation of biological weapons research. The stage was set for final confrontation between biological weapons deployment and government military response that would determine whether viral outbreaks could be contained through conventional means, or whether biological warfare represented new form of conflict that exceeded traditional military capabilities and required unprecedented international cooperation. Raccoon City had become ground zero for humanity's transition from theoretical biological weapons research to practical deployment scenarios that threatened to reshape civilization according to principles of viral evolution and corporate profit maximization rather than human welfare and democratic governance. The death spiral was accelerating beyond any single organization's ability to control as viral organisms evolved through contact with diverse human populations. While corporate authorities struggled to maintain operational security and government forces prepared responses that would test whether biological weapons could be contained through application of overwhelming conventional military force. The question was no longer whether Raccoon City could be saved, but rather whether the lessons learned from its destruction would prevent similar incidents from occurring in other urban centers, where biological weapons research continued under corporate and government auspices that prioritized strategic advantage over human safety and international stability. The decision to deploy nuclear weapons against an American city represented the most extreme military action ever authorized on domestic soil, but by October 1, 1998, government officials who had witnessed satellite footage of Raccoon City's transformation understood that conventional containment measures were inadequate for preventing biological contamination from spreading to neighboring population centers. Military planners who had initially hoped that Umbrella's corporate security forces could contain the viral outbreak discovered through reconnaissance operations that the company had actually been using the crisis as large-scale field testing opportunity for biological weapons effectiveness. Rather than implementing containment protocols, corporate personnel had been documenting creature behavior and collecting combat effectiveness data, while civilian casualties mounted exponentially. The psychological impact on government officials who authorized the nuclear strike would haunt American military and political leadership for decades. The realization that domestic policy decisions could require sacrificing an entire city to prevent national catastrophe challenged fundamental assumptions about government's responsibility to protect civilian populations, while revealing the inadequacy of existing emergency response frameworks. President Clinton's final authorization came after reviewing classified intelligence reports that indicated viral contamination was beginning to spread beyond Raccoon City limits through wildlife migration patterns and underground water systems that connected to regional water supplies. The potential for biological weapons to contaminate major metropolitan areas created national security emergency that justified extreme measures. Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield's final escape from Raccoon City occurred during the narrow window between nuclear launch authorization and missile impact. Their helicopter evacuation provided government authorities with direct witness testimony about biological weapons deployment, while simultaneously demonstrating that individual survival was possible even under conditions that exceeded every catastrophic scenario that emergency planners had developed. Adair Wong's extraction with Gi virus samples represented the successful completion of corporate espionage operations that had continued throughout the city's destruction. Her escape ensured that biological weapons research data would survive Raccoon City's nuclear sterilization, while providing rival organizations with access to viral technology that could accelerate international biological weapons proliferation. The nuclear warhead that destroyed Raccoon City had been specifically selected for its ability to generate temperatures that would sterilize biological contamination while creating radioactive environment that would prevent detailed forensic investigation of Umbrella's underground research facilities. The weapon's design prioritized complete destruction of evidence over minimizing long-term environmental damage. Sherry Birkin's evacuation as infected but stable survivor provided government researchers with living subject for studying G-virus effects, while raising ethical questions about how individuals with viral exposure should be treated by authorities who lacked comprehensive understanding of biological weapons technology. Her condition represented both medical opportunity and potential security threat. The evacuation procedures implemented during Raccoon City's final hours revealed the inadequacy of existing emergency response systems for managing biological weapons crises. Military personnel tasked with survivor extraction lacked training and equipment for operating in contaminated environments while maintaining protection against viral organisms that could spread through air, water, and direct contact. International observers who monitored the nuclear strike through satellite surveillance and seismic detection systems recognized immediately that they had witnessed unprecedented government response to biological weapons deployment. The implications for international law, military doctrine, and emergency preparedness created urgent requirements for diplomatic coordination and treaty revision. The media response to Raccoon City's destruction demonstrated the effectiveness of information control measures that government and corporate authorities had implemented to prevent public awareness of biological weapons programs. News organizations received sanitized accounts of industrial accident and terrorist attack rather than accurate reporting about viral outbreak and nuclear sterilization. Corporate damage control operations that Umbrella implemented following the nuclear strike focused on transferring assets and personnel to international facilities, while destroying evidence that could connect the company to biological weapons research and deployment activities. Spencer's contingency plans had anticipated potential loss of American operations and included strategies for maintaining global network. The economic impact of destroying an entire American city exceeded every financial model that insurance companies and government agencies had developed for evaluating disaster costs. The implications for urban planning, industrial development, and national security spending would reshape American domestic and international policy, while creating precedents for extreme government response to unconventional threats. Survivor psychology studies that emerged from debriefing individuals who had escaped Raccoon City revealed trauma patterns that exceeded anything documented in disaster response literature. The psychological impact of witnessing friends and family members transform into biological weapons created mental health challenges that conventional therapy approaches were inadequate for addressing. Military tactical analysis of biological weapons effectiveness in urban environment provided defense planners with comprehensive data about viral warfare capabilities, while revealing vulnerabilities in conventional military doctrine that would require fundamental changes in training, equipment, and strategic planning for future biological threats. The international intelligence community's assessment of American government's nuclear response to biological weapons deployment created new frameworks for evaluating national security threats, while establishing precedents for extreme military measures that other governments might implement if confronted with similar biological weapons crises. Corporate legal strategies that Umbrella implemented following Raccoon City's destruction focused on maintaining plausible deniability about biological weapons research, while redirecting blame toward government military contractors and foreign terrorist organizations that had allegedly infiltrated legitimate pharmaceutical research programs. The scientific value of data collected during Raccoon City's biological weapons deployment provided military and corporate researchers with unprecedented intelligence about viral warfare, effectiveness against civilian populations, while raising ethical questions about how such information should be utilized in future weapons development programs. Environmental contamination resulting from nuclear sterilization of biological weapons outbreak created radioactive wasteland that would remain uninhabitable for decades, while serving as permanent reminder of the consequences that could result from biological weapons research and deployment activities. The precedent established by American government's willingness to deploy nuclear weapons against domestic targets fundamentally altered international perceptions of biological weapons threats, while demonstrating that even democratic governments would authorize extreme measures to prevent viral contamination from spreading to larger population centers. Spencer's corporate empire had achieved practical demonstration of biological weapons capabilities through Raccoon City deployment, while simultaneously creating evidence trail and survivor testimony that would eventually lead to international prosecution efforts and comprehensive regulation of biological weapons research activities. The stage was set for global transformation of biological weapons policy, as international organizations struggled to develop regulatory frameworks adequate for preventing similar incidents, while military planners incorporated lessons learned from Raccoon City into strategic planning for future biological warfare scenarios. The nuclear solution had successfully contained viral contamination within Raccoon City limits, but the broader implications of biological weapons deployment had spread far beyond any single incident location. International intelligence agencies now possess detailed evidence about viral warfare capabilities, while corporate and government entities involved in biological weapons research recognized that their activities could trigger responses that exceeded conventional military measures. Government officials who had authorized nuclear strike against American City discovered that extreme military responses to biological weapons threats created international precedents that could justify similar measures by other nations confronted with viral outbreaks that threatened regional or global security. The destruction of Raccoon City marked the end of theoretical biological weapons research and the beginning of practical viral warfare era, where corporate research programs and government military applications would be evaluated according to their potential for triggering catastrophic responses that could require nuclear intervention to prevent global contamination. The lessons learned from America's first domestic nuclear strike would reshape international law, military doctrine, and biological weapons policy, while serving as warning about the ultimate consequences that could result from allowing corporate and government entities to pursue biological weapons research without adequate oversight and accountability measures. The radioactive crater where Raccoon City had once stood became a monument to humanity's first encounter with biological weapons of mass destruction. But the true consequences of Umbrella Corporation's collapse were spreading across global intelligence networks and corporate boardrooms, where the implications of viral warfare were being evaluated by organizations that possessed their own biological research programs. International investigators who attempted to piece together the events leading to Raccoon City's nuclear destruction discovered that Umbrella's global network had been systematically transferring assets, personnel, and research data to subsidiary companies and shell corporations in dozens of countries where regulatory oversight was minimal and government corruption ensured operational secrecy. The United States Congress convened emergency hearings to investigate government and corporate responsibility for the biological weapons crisis, but testimony from surviving witnesses was systematically discredited through character assassination campaigns that portrayed survivors as trauma victims whose accounts were unreliable due to psychological damage from their ordeal. Spencer's personal assets had been distributed among offshore accounts and international holding companies years before Raccoon City's destruction, ensuring that corporate prosecution efforts would encounter legal obstacles that could delay accountability indefinitely, while allowing biological weapons research to continue under different organizational structures. European pharmaceutical companies that had maintained research partnerships with Umbrella discovered that their facilities contained viral samples and research data that exceeded their official knowledge of biological weapons development programs. The discovery of classified materials in legitimate medical research installations created international diplomatic crises as governments struggled to determine which organizations could be trusted with biological research oversight. Tricell Corporation emerged as Umbrella's primary successor organization through acquisition of assets and personnel that had been strategically positioned in African and Asian markets, where government regulation of pharmaceutical research was inconsistent and international oversight was difficult to implement effectively. The BSAA formation represented international recognition that biological weapons threats exceeded individual government capabilities for detection, containment, and response. However, the organization's mandate was deliberately limited to advisory and support roles that would not infringe on national sovereignty or corporate intellectual property rights. Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine's recruitment into international counter-bioterrorism operations reflected government recognition that individuals with direct experience surviving biological weapons encounters possessed expertise that conventional military and intelligence personnel lacked, despite extensive training and advanced equipment. Corporate espionage operations that had been initiated during Raccoon City's destruction produced intelligence windfalls for rival organizations that had been competing with Umbrella for biological weapons development contracts. The corporate collapse created opportunities for acquiring research data and experienced personnel at fractions of normal costs, while regulatory attention focused on prosecuting obvious violations. Academic institutions that had received research grants from Umbrella discovered that their biological research programs had been unknowingly contributing to weapons development through projects that appeared to involve legitimate medical applications, but were actually designed to advance military bioweapons capabilities. The pharmaceutical industry's reputation suffered permanent damage as public awareness of biological weapons research capabilities spread through media coverage and survivor testimonies. Despite corporate and government efforts to control information flow and maintain public confidence in medical research institutions, international treaty negotiations that attempted to strengthen biological weapons prohibitions encountered resistance from government military research programs and corporate interests that argued defensive research required capabilities that could be indistinguishable from offensive weapons development during early research phases. Underground markets for biological weapons research data and viral samples created shadow economy, where former Umbrella personnel could auction their expertise to the highest bidders regardless of their intentions for utilizing biological weapons capabilities or their commitment to international law and ethical research practices. The psychological impact on government officials who had been responsible for oversight of biological weapons research programs created institutional trauma that affected decision-making processes for years, as regulatory agencies struggled to balance legitimate medical research needs against potential weapons applications. Leon Kennedy's recruitment into government anti-bioterrorism operations demonstrated recognition that biological weapons threats required specialized personnel who possessed both combat effectiveness and psychological resilience necessary for confronting viral creatures whose existence challenged fundamental assumptions about life and death. Insurance industry evaluations of biological weapons risks revealed that existing policy frameworks were inadequate for covering potential damages from viral outbreaks, while risk assessment models failed to account for the exponential growth patterns that characterized biological weapons deployment in population centers. Medical research institutions that had lost personnel to Umbrella's recruitment programs discovered that their former employees possessed knowledge about advanced biological techniques that exceeded official research publications, suggesting that significant scientific developments had been concealed from academic and professional communities. International intelligence sharing agreements that were established to prevent biological weapons proliferation created new bureaucratic structures that often hindered rapid response to emerging threats, while providing cover for continued classified research programs that government agencies claimed were necessary for national defense. Corporate legal strategies that were developed to protect biological research investments created regulatory capture scenarios, where industry influence over government oversight agencies prevented effective monitoring of potentially dangerous research activities, while maintaining public confidence in regulatory effectiveness. The economic disruption caused by Umbrella's collapse affected global pharmaceutical markets, as investors struggled to evaluate which companies possessed legitimate medical research capabilities versus those that might be involved in biological weapons development programs that could trigger similar government intervention. Survivor support programs that were established for individuals who had been exposed to biological weapons revealed medical needs that exceeded existing healthcare system capabilities, while raising questions about long-term effects of viral exposure on human health and genetic stability. International cooperation agreements between government agencies and private research institutions created complex relationships where legitimate medical research funded potential weapons development, while corporate innovations enhanced government biological defense capabilities, through partnerships that obscured accountability and oversight. The precedent established by nuclear response to biological weapons deployment influenced military planning in dozens of countries as defense establishments evaluated scenarios where similar extreme measures might be justified to prevent viral contamination from spreading beyond containment perimeters. Corporate successor organizations to Umbrella implemented sophisticated compartmentalization strategies that ensured individual researchers never gained comprehensive knowledge of biological weapons development programs, while maintaining continuity in research activities that could produce military applications. The global distribution of former Umbrella personnel created international security challenges, as intelligence agencies attempted to monitor individuals whose expertise could accelerate biological weapons development in countries that lacked established regulatory frameworks or commitment to international treaty obligations. Research institutions that had been investigating countermeasures for biological weapons discovered that their defensive research required capabilities that were functionally identical to offensive weapons development, creating ethical dilemmas about how medical research could proceed without potentially contributing to future biological warfare capabilities. The stage was set for decades of biological weapons proliferation as corporate research programs evolved new organizational structures designed to evade regulatory oversight, while government agencies struggled to balance legitimate medical research needs against potential weapons applications that could trigger catastrophic responses. International recognition that biological weapons represented existential threats requiring unprecedented cooperation created new diplomatic frameworks, but implementation of effective oversight measures was hindered by corporate interests and national security concerns that prioritize competitive advantages over global security and humanitarian considerations. The decade following Raccoon City's destruction witnessed humanity's reluctant adaptation to a world where biological weapons had evolved from theoretical research projects into practical tools of warfare, terrorism, and corporate competition. The assumption that nuclear sterilization had ended the bioweapons threat proved catastrophically naive as viral research data and trained personnel spread across dozens of organizations that viewed Umbrella's collapse as opportunity rather than cautionary tale. Los Illuminados parasites that infected a remote Spanish village in 2004 demonstrated how biological weapons technology had proliferated beyond corporate and government control into the hands of religious extremists and political radicals who possessed neither scientific understanding nor ethical restraints that might limit their deployment decisions. The Las Plagas organism represented evolutionary advancement that exceeded T-virus capabilities while remaining completely outside established regulatory frameworks. Leon Kennedy's mission to rescue the president's daughter from parasitic infection revealed that individual exposure to biological weapons had become routine assignment for government agents, whose survival required constant adaptation to viral threats that evolved continuously through exposure to human immune systems and environmental challenges. The Ouroboros virus development in West Africa represented Tricell Corporation's attempt to create biological weapons that could selectively target specific ethnic populations while leaving others unaffected. This advancement in precision biological warfare raised ethical questions about genetic discrimination, while demonstrating that corporate research programs continued pursuing applications that exceeded even Umbrella's original weapons development objectives. Chris Redfield and Shiva Alamar's partnership during the African bioweapons crisis illustrated how international cooperation had become essential for confronting biological threats that transcended national boundaries, while revealing persistent tensions between developed nations and regions whose populations had been disproportionately affected by biological weapons testing and deployment. The corporate rebranding strategies that allowed former Umbrella assets to continue operating under different organizational identities created regulatory challenges that international oversight agencies were structurally incapable of addressing. Companies like Neo Umbrella emerged with identical personnel and research capabilities, but different legal structures that provided protection from prosecution and accountability measures. Bioterrorism incidents that occurred throughout the 2000s established patterns where viral outbreaks were contained through military intervention and media suppression, rather than prevention, through effective regulation of biological research activities. Each incident provided tactical experience for response teams while demonstrating that existing frameworks remained inadequate for preventing future attacks. The pharmaceutical industry's adaptation to post-Raccoon City scrutiny involved sophisticated public relations campaigns that emphasized medical benefits of biological research while obscuring potential weapons applications through technical language and compartmentalized research programs that prevented individual scientists from understanding broader implications of their work. Academic institutions found themselves navigating ethical challenges, where legitimate medical research required capabilities that could accelerate biological weapons development, while funding pressures from government and corporate sources created incentives for pursuing research directions that might compromise scientific independence and ethical integrity. Military doctrine evolution in response to biological weapons proliferation created new strategic frameworks, where conventional warfare superiority became secondary to biological defense capabilities and rapid containment, responses that could prevent viral outbreaks from escalating beyond manageable parameters. International treaty negotiations continued encountering obstacles created by the fundamental difficulty of distinguishing between legitimate biological research and potential weapons development during early research phases, while enforcement mechanisms remained dependent on voluntary compliance by organizations whose commercial and strategic interests prioritize competitive advantages over international security. The psychology of survival in bioweapons environments became a specialized field of study as military and intelligence agencies recognized that conventional combat training was inadequate preparation for confronting biological threats that challenged basic assumptions about life, death, and human identity. Corporate liability strategies developed in response to Umbrella's collapse influenced global business practices, as companies invested heavily in legal protections and information security measures, designed to prevent accountability for research activities that might produce harmful applications or unintended consequences. Underground markets for biological weapons technology created parallel economy, where former corporate researchers, discharged military personnel, and criminal organizations could collaborate on projects that exceeded any government or international organization's ability to monitor or control through conventional law enforcement methods. The genetic enhancement capabilities that had originally motivated Spencer's research vision became reality through medical applications that gradually normalized human modification while creating social hierarchies based on biological capabilities, rather than traditional measures of achievement or social contribution. Religious and ideological movements that incorporated biological transformation into their belief systems created new categories of threat, where viral weapons deployment was motivated by spiritual conviction rather than strategic objectives, making traditional deterrence and negotiation approaches ineffective for preventing attacks. The environmental impact of biological weapons deployment extended beyond immediate human casualties to include ecosystem disruption, genetic contamination of wildlife populations, and long-term environmental changes that affected agricultural productivity and ecological stability across regions where viral outbreaks had occurred. Medical ethics frameworks that had been developed for traditional healthcare applications proved inadequate for addressing questions about genetic modification, viral enhancement, and biological weapons countermeasures that blurred distinctions between therapeutic intervention and human experimentation. Intelligence sharing agreements between nations created new forms of international cooperation, while simultaneously providing cover for continued biological weapons. Research that individual countries justified as necessary for national defense against threats that their information sharing had helped identify and characterize. The economic impact of biological weapons proliferation created new industries focused on detection, containment, and response capabilities, while disrupting traditional security markets and insurance frameworks that had been designed for conventional threats rather than viral warfare scenarios. Corporate succession planning in biological research industries became increasingly sophisticated as companies learned from Umbrella's collapse to implement asset protection and continuity strategies that could survive government intervention, legal prosecution, and public relations disasters without interrupting research activities. The stage was set for permanent transformation of human civilization as biological weapons became integrated into military, corporate, and criminal activities. while social institutions struggled to adapt to threats that exceeded traditional frameworks for understanding warfare, terrorism, and technological risk management. International recognition that biological weapons represented existential threat, requiring unprecedented cooperation, continued encountering obstacles created by competitive dynamics between corporations, governments, and ideological movements that viewed viral capabilities as tools for achieving objectives that justified risks to global security and human survival. The eternal consequences of umbrella corporations' biological weapons research have become permanent features of human civilization, as viral technology proliferated beyond any single organization's ability to control, while creating evolutionary pressures that would reshape humanity according to biological, rather than cultural or political principles. The second decade of the 21st century has witnessed the emergence of biological weapons applications that exceed even Spencer's most grandiose visions for human enhancement and viral warfare. The organizations that inherited Umbrella's research legacy have evolved beyond simple corporate structures into transnational networks that operate with resources and capabilities, rivaling those of nation-states while pursuing objectives that transcend conventional understanding of biological weapons development. Neo-Umbrella's emergence in 2012 demonstrated that corporate rebranding could successfully resurrect biological weapons programs that had been officially terminated through international prosecution efforts. The organization's deployment of C-virus in urban environments across multiple continents revealed coordination capabilities and strategic planning that exceeded anything achieved during Umbrella's original operations. The C-virus itself represented evolutionary advancement in biological weapons design that incorporated lessons learned from decades of viral warfare experience. Unlike previous strains that produced unpredictable transformations, C-virus could create biological weapons optimized for specific tactical objectives, while maintaining enough cognitive function to follow complex commands and adapt to changing battlefield conditions. Adol Wang's continued involvement in international bioweapons espionage operations illustrated how individual agents had become permanent fixtures in shadow economy, where viral research data and biological samples were traded among organizations whose identities and objectives remained hidden from conventional intelligence monitoring systems. The Tall Oaks incident that preceded global C-virus deployment provided definitive proof that biological weapons had evolved beyond containment through conventional military intervention. The speed and scale of viral contamination exceeded every response framework that government agencies had developed based on earlier bioweapons encounters, requiring nuclear sterilization of American territory for the second time in 15 years. Chris Redfield's psychological breakdown during the Adonia conflict reflected broader patterns of trauma accumulation among personnel who had been repeatedly exposed to biological weapons environments. The mental health consequences of confronting viral threats created personnel challenges for organizations that required experienced operatives, but struggled to maintain their psychological stability through multiple bioweapons encounters. International cooperation through expanded BSAA operations revealed both the potential and limitations of multilateral approaches to biological weapons threats. While information sharing and coordinated responses had improved significantly since Raccoon City, the fundamental challenge remained that biological weapons proliferation occurred faster than regulatory and response capabilities could adapt. The discovery that biological weapons research was being conducted in academic institutions, legitimate pharmaceutical companies, and government medical facilities created accountability crises that extended far beyond obviously criminal organizations. The integration of weapons development into normal scientific research made identification and prevention of harmful applications nearly impossible through conventional oversight methods. Corporate legal strategies that protected biological research investments had evolved sophisticated approaches for maintaining plausible deniability, while facilitating continued weapons development through shell companies, academic partnerships, and government research contracts that obscured true objectives and accountability relationships. The emergence of biological weapons applications in non-state conflicts demonstrated how viral technology had become accessible to organizations that lacked sophisticated scientific infrastructure, but possessed sufficient funding and personnel recruitment capabilities to acquire necessary expertise through underground markets and defector scientists. Religious and ideological movements that incorporated biological transformation into their belief systems created new categories of threat where viral weapons deployment served spiritual or political objectives rather than strategic military goals. These organizations often demonstrated willingness to accept catastrophic consequences that made traditional deterrence approaches ineffective. Environmental consequences of repeated biological weapons deployments had begun affecting global ecosystems in ways that extended beyond immediate human casualties. Viral contamination of agricultural systems, wildlife populations, and water supplies created long-term challenges that would influence human survival and social stability for generations beyond any specific bioweapons incident. The genetic modification capabilities that biological weapons technology made possible had gradually normalized human enhancement through medical applications, while creating social pressures for competitive enhancement that could reshape human civilization according to biological rather than cultural criteria. Underground markets for biological weapons technology continued expanding as former corporate researchers, discharged military personnel, and criminal organizations developed distribution networks that operated beyond any government's ability to monitor or control through conventional law enforcement approaches. The psychological adaptation required for survival in environments where biological weapons deployment had become routine created new forms of human experience that challenged traditional concepts of mental health, social relationships, and individual identity. People who could function effectively in bioweapons environments often demonstrated characteristics that made normal social integration difficult or impossible. Military doctrine evolution continued incorporating lessons learned from biological weapons encounters, but the fundamental challenge remained that viral threats evolved continuously through exposure to countermeasures, while conventional military capabilities developed much more slowly through institutional and technological constraints. International treaty frameworks that attempted to regulate biological weapons development encountered persistent obstacles created by the impossibility of distinguishing between legitimate medical research and potential weapons applications during early development phases, while enforcement mechanisms remained dependent on voluntary compliance by organizations whose interests prioritized competitive advantages over international security. The precedent established by nuclear responses to biological weapons threats influenced military planning globally as defense establishments prepared for scenarios where extreme measures might be necessary to prevent viral contamination from spreading beyond containment perimeters, potentially requiring destruction of major population centers. Corporate succession planning in industries related to biological research had incorporated sophisticated asset protection and continuity strategies designed to survive government intervention, legal prosecution, and public relations disasters without interrupting research activities that might produce commercially valuable or strategically important applications. The stage has been set for permanent integration of biological weapons into human civilization, as viral technology becomes increasingly sophisticated, while social institutions struggle to develop effective approaches for managing threats that exceed traditional frameworks for understanding warfare, terrorism, and technological risk. The question facing humanity in the modern bioterror era is not whether biological weapons will continue proliferating, but rather whether human civilization can adapt rapidly enough to survive the consequences of technologies that were originally designed to enhance human capabilities, but have evolved into existential threats, requiring constant vigilance and unprecedented international cooperation. The legacy of that 1966 discovery in the West African wilderness has become permanently woven into the fabric of human experience. The Progenitor virus that 3 university students thought would revolutionize medicine has instead revolutionized warfare, terrorism, and the fundamental nature of human survival in ways that continue expanding beyond anyone's ability to predict or control. Every biological weapons incident, from Spencer's original corporate empire through contemporary transnational networks, can trace its origins to that moment when scientific curiosity overcame caution and humanity gained access to evolutionary forces that natural selection had refined over millions of years. The flower that promised immortality delivered something far more complex and dangerous. The future of biological weapons development remains as unpredictable as the viral organisms themselves, capable of evolutionary leaps that will continue challenging human understanding and survival capabilities. while reshaping civilization according to biological principles that prioritize adaptation and proliferation over the cultural values that have traditionally defined human progress and social organization.